I never used to believe in emotions. To me, they were burdens, clutter in my already chaotic head. I had perfected the art of detachment, thinking it would make me invincible. I scoffed at the idea that vulnerability could ever lead to strength, but life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you're least prepared. It started one rainy afternoon when I received a voicemail from my estranged father. You see, we hadn't spoken in years, a fact I wore like armor, believing it shielded me from pain. But when I heard his voice cracking through my phone like a fragile egg, all the walls I had built came tumbling down. He was calling from a hospital bed, a place I once thought I'd never be connected to in any way, asking for forgiveness. I felt a mixture of anger and pity, a toxic cocktail I didn't know how to handle. I thought about hanging up, about burying the feelings that rose up inside me like a tidal wave threatening to swallow me whole. Instead, I gripped the phone tighter, listening to each word that felt like knives. "I'm sorry I failed you," he said, his voice quaking. Something deep inside me stirred, something I had shoved down for so long that it felt foreign. I swallowed hard, trapped between the urge to scream and the urge to cry. I chose silence. Days passed, and I became increasingly obsessed with the voicemail, playing it over and over again like it was a cursed artifact, trying to decode what my response should be, what my life could look like if I stopped pretending emotions didn't exist. I imagined what it would be like to forgive him, to let go of the hurt I had clutched like a lifeline. But what if I opened that door? I could feel it slipping away, my carefully constructed defenses, and it terrified me in ways I couldn't articulate. That Saturday, I went for a drive, hoping maybe the road would guide me. I turned off my phone, pulled the windows down, and let the cold wind slap against my face, but nothing prepared me for what awaited me at the edge of a secluded forest road. An old woman appeared out of nowhere, standing beneath a gnarled tree with branches that looked like skeletal fingers reaching towards the sky. She wore a tattered shawl, and the rain trickled down her face like tears. I pressed the brake, stopping inches away from her. As I rolled down the window, she pointed a bony finger at me. "You carry heaviness, child. They will come for you." It was so absurd that I chuckled nervously, ready to dismiss her completely. But her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that froze the laughter in my throat. "You must embrace it, you know. Face your fears or remain a prisoner of your own heart," she said, her voice shaking. I felt a chill run down my spine. She spoke as if she knew about the voicemail, about everything I hadn't let myself feel. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, fading into the drizzling twilight as if she were a figment of my imagination. I sat there in stunned silence, her words looping in my mind like a broken record. I drove home with a knot in my stomach, feeling distinctly haunted. The next day, determined to confront my emotions, I decided to visit my father. It felt surreal when I approached the sterile hospital room, but there was a nagging optimism gnawing at me. He looked frail, smaller than I remembered, and my heart softened despite all the armor I had wrapped around it. "I'm sorry," I stuttered as I walked in, unable to disguise my wavering voice. He looked up, startled, his eyes widening as if he was seeing me for the first time in years. "You don't have to be," he replied, but I could see the tears pooling in his eyes. I didn't want to move, afraid that the act of reaching out might shatter this fragile moment. But then I remembered the woman in the woods, her icy talon-like finger pointing at me, imploring me to embrace the fear rather than run from it. I stepped closer. "No, I need to say this. I've been angry for so long. I thought forgetting would make it easier, but it didn't. It only made it worse." Suddenly, all that pent-up emotion exploded like a shaken bottle of soda. I collapsed into sobs I didn't know were trapped inside me, drowning in the pain of all those lost years. To my surprise, my father didn't recoil. He reached out, frail fingers tapping my hand gently, and that simple act felt cathartic. We began exchanging stories, speaking of hurt, loss, regret, and, strangely, love. With each shared confession, I felt bricks fall from the wall I had built, one by one. There was laughter, amidst the tears. I learned that emotions could connect us, create bridges over the chasms time had carved in our relationship. Hours later, I left the hospital feeling lighter, cradling the newfound truth like a fragile artifact. The old woman hadn't just been right, she had been a messenger, though I didn't know how she knew. I returned to that forest road often, seeking her, needing guidance as I grappled with this evolution of my emotional landscape. Though I never ran into her again, I felt her presence within me, guiding me toward uncomfortable confrontations but also unlocking hidden joys. I learned to embrace all emotions, the heart-wrenching heartbreak, the soul-tingling joy, the awkward vulnerability. Each one, I discovered, told a story worth hearing. I slowly started to weave these emotions into my everyday life, and for the first time in years, I felt alive, at one with myself and others. I found comfort in family, friendship, and love. I even started writing again, pouring my truths onto paper, crafting tales born from the legitimacy of my experiences. I learned that embracing emotions wasn't about vulnerability or fear, it was a reclamation of the self. I still remember that old lady, her eerie words ingrained in my psyche, reminding me every day that we must face what haunts us. Life isn't meant to be lived armored, it's meant to be felt deeply, passionately. Who knew that in confronting the raw edges of my life, I'd find a rich tapestry of existence waiting on the other side of fear? Now, instead of avoiding my emotions, I wade through them, allowing their depths to color my world, no longer afraid of their weight, but empowered by their truth. I never considered myself a particularly skilled person, but I always had an insatiable desire to learn. It started when I stumbled upon a subreddit dedicated to a peculiar form of shadow puppetry. The users there described a technique that supposedly could unlock the secrets of storytelling without words, but of course, they were also discussing it in a way that felt grimmer than your usual art forum. Some boasted about how they had perfected these shadow tricks over time, mesmerized their friends, even haunted their neighbors with the eerily lifelike silhouettes. I was captivated, engrossed by tales of how the shadows could take on a life of their own, turning benign shapes into grotesque figures that suggested more than they showed. Intrigued, I fell down the rabbit hole and found a few tutorials, which explained the essential techniques: hand positioning, light sources, manipulation of space. I decided I wanted to master it, but I realized it would take hours of practice to even come close to what the practitioners on that subreddit could achieve. That's where the obsessive part of my personality kicked in. I started to practice in my basement after work, shoving the old furniture against the walls to make the perfect blank canvas. Each night, I would refine my technique. I became so absorbed that my daily cleaning routine and even simple meals fell by the wayside. Gradually, I began to create haunting representations that sent chills down my own spine. On the third night of my practice, I created a shadow of something truly unsettling. I stood in front of the light, casting a figure that looked eerily like a child with elongated limbs and an impossibly wide grin. The moment I formed that grin, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, even though all the windows were shut. Chills raced down my arms, but I brushed it off. Perhaps I was just overthinking things. After all, that could easily be explained as a draft or the house settling. But as I continued to refine my technique, I couldn't shake the odd feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Days turned into weeks, and I honed the craft. Where I had started by practicing basic shapes, I was now constructing entire narratives. But every night, the atmosphere in the basement grew heavier. Shadows seemed to flicker as they danced on the walls, forming shapes that I had not controlled. Mysterious whispers filled my ears, almost like voices murmuring secrets. Each time I thought about stopping or taking a break, I felt as though I would lose that momentum, that connection I had forged with whatever it was manifesting in those dark corners. I found myself growing more and more paranoid, convinced that if I didn't practice each evening, the shadows would disappear forever, taking with them the enigmatic energy I had come to rely on. As Halloween approached, I decided to host a small gathering for a few close friends. I wanted to show them my progress, but I couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that gloomed over every advanced shadow I cast. The day of the gathering, I spent hours preparing. I made sure to only invite friends who appreciated art and could maintain an open mind about the strange practices I'd engaged in. That night, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared and darkness seeped into the corners of the room, my friends entered the basement, naive to the dread that lingered. I started with simple shapes, using an old lamp as my only light source. They laughed along with my attempts, but it wasn't until I unveiled my favorite creation, the elongated child, when things took a turn. As I formed the shadows, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter faded into stunned silence. The shadow of that creature filled the wall, and an unnatural chill crept into the room. A muffled screech echoed, but not from me. My friends' faces twisted into expressions of horror as they caught sight of something beyond my control. The shadow of the creature was beginning to morph. It formed into something reclining, half-formed against the edges of the lampshade, as if it were emerging from the darkness itself. In a panic, I waved my arms, trying to push the dark figure back, but it only seemed to encourage it. Its grin stretched wider, impossibly so, and suddenly, the shadows in the room darkened unnaturally. They whispered my name. Someone shouted for the light to be turned on, and one of my friends stumbled over to flip the switch. But the bulb flickered, overwhelmed by a surge of darkness. The room erupted into chaos, with my friends screaming as they bolted toward the stairs. I was frozen, paralyzed in a blend of panic and fascination. I couldn't understand what was happening. My shadows, the things I had created, were turning against me. I reached for the light again, desperate to break the spell that had taken hold of my guests. But when I finally flicked the switch, I was met with silence. The shadows were gone, and only my trembling friends remained, huddled against each other in terror. They would later tell me that while the creature hadn't been corporeal, they could still feel its malice. We never spoke of that night again. Friends drifted away, and the once warm laughter vanished from my house, leaving me with my craft. I withdrew deeper into the shadows, practicing more than ever, hoping to regain that connection. I soon discovered that the more I practiced, the more the darkness responded. I could shape it, it obeyed and resisted me in equal measures. I was not just experiencing shadows anymore, I was conversing with something far darker, tracking the contours of its gloom with my hands. I became a vessel for creating phantoms. Months passed as I spiraled deeper into the abyss of this learning. I honed my craft to the point where the line between my creations and the shadows of the room blurred. I no longer looked for approval or understanding from anyone else, I just felt the need to create. One fateful evening, I became obsessed with crafting the figure of a woman, her silhouette draped in a flowing gown. As I worked, a whisper slipped through my consciousness, its tone both alluring and malicious, and I followed it like a moth drawn to flame. I finally manifested that figure, and as I did so, her shadows enveloped me, pulling me into darkness as if desiring my very essence. The last thought I had before everything went black was the realization that I had encouraged something to take form, something I could no longer control, and in my endeavor to develop a new skill through relentless practice, I had lost myself completely. And now, I live in the shadows, forever practicing what I can no longer master. When I helped a child learn to read, a rewarding experience. It began on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the sky is an oppressive shade of gray and the world just feels too heavy. I was volunteering at the local community center, not expecting anything out of the ordinary, just hoping to make a small difference in someone's life. That day, I was assigned to work with a young girl named Emma. She was 8 years old, bright-eyed yet timid, with a wild mop of curly hair that bounced as she shuffled in, clutching a tattered book that looked well-loved yet barely held together. I sat with her against the wall, surrounded by a few scattered cushions, and asked her to tell me about her favorite stories. Her eyes lit up as she described fantastical worlds and heroic characters, but then she sighed, her enthusiasm dampening. "But I can't read yet," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Something in the way she said it hit me hard. It felt like she wore the shame of it like a heavy cloak, dragging her spirit down. I knew right then and there that my mission had changed from just reading the words on a page to helping her lift that burden. As we flipped through the pages together, she struggled, stuttering on simple words. Each time she stumbled, I could see the frustration welling up in her, and every mispronunciation felt like a direct hit to her self-esteem. I remembered my own childhood, the challenges I faced with reading, and I decided right then that today wasn't going to be just another learning session. It was going to be an adventure. I told her that every story was like a treasure map full of hidden secrets, and that if we could decode the treasure map, we could discover a world filled with wonders. I reached deep into my bag and pulled out a stack of colorful flashcards I'd prepared. Each card bore a story, a character, or a magical creature, and I challenged her to read them out loud, one at a time. At first, she hesitated, wringing her hands and biting her lip, but the excitement in my voice seemed to chip away at her fear. Slowly but surely, she began to read, her confidence growing with each card. "Dragon," she exclaimed, the word bursting from her like a belated firework. To celebrate, I jumped up and clapped, and her laughter filled the small room, a sound so rich that it could drown out the relentless rain outside. But as we pressed on, the excitement began to wane. Emma's eyes clouded over when we reached harder passages, and frustration set in again. "What's the point?" She pouted, slumping against the wall, and I knew I had to find a way to reignite that spark. I told her a story of my own struggles, how I had fought battles with words that seemed too big to conquer, and how I had eventually found a secret weapon: imagination. When you can't read the words, just close your eyes and let your mind create the pictures, I suggested. To my delight, she giggled and closed her eyes, and I decided to turn this moment into something magical. I began to weave a tale, a vivid and whimsical narrative about a girl who found a golden feather in her backyard, which allowed her to talk to animals and embark on the grandest adventures. I painted scenes in her mind, letting her join every twist and turn of the journey, and when she opened her eyes, her face was aglow. "Can we go back to the book?" she asked earnestly. I nodded, and when we returned to the words she'd struggled with moments before, something astonishing happened. She began decoding them through the lens of the wild narrative we created together. "Look! It's like the dragon in our story," she shouted, her pronunciation clearer and more confident. We slashed through 100 pages that day, tales unraveling before us like ribbons in a breeze, and by the end of our session, Emma had managed to read a simple story on her own. Tears stung my eyes as I watched her face light up with unabashed pride, a treasure more valuable than any gold. I knew in that moment, the experience was not just about helping her read, it was about igniting a lifelong love for storytelling. It was about empowerment. I felt a pulse of energy between us, a connection formed in that room. She was no longer just a girl struggling with reading but a budding storyteller ready to soar. As I packed my things, I noticed something drop from the pages of her book, a small note folded neatly. I picked it up curiously, and when I opened it, my heart seized. "I can't wait to tell you my own stories," it read in her careful handwriting, "but I need your help." Over the next few sessions, we crafted tales together, and Emma bloomed like a wildflower in the sun. However, one day she didn't show up. I waited, worried her spirit had dimmed without my encouragement, thinking perhaps she felt defeated again. Days turned to weeks, and she remained absent. I finally approached the community center staff, who glanced at each other grimly, and I felt a chill run down my spine. They eventually confessed that Emma had been hospitalized, her mother in a panic over her worsening health. My heart raced as they described her condition, and I felt I had to reach out. I decided to visit her at the hospital, clutching a storybook and my flashcards as my offering. The rainy day had returned, casting shadows over the sterile walls of her room, but when I entered, I saw her lying there, eyes dimmed but hands still clutching a story. "Emma," I breathed, rushing to her side. She smiled weakly, but I could see the same spark of imagination flicker within her. I pulled out the flashcards and began to read, my voice steady. We transformed that hospital room into our own world, battling dragons and exploring enchanted forests. Emma laughed, her spirit emerging like a bird from its cage, even while her body remained weak. "I can't remember how to tell my stories," she said, her voice a whisper. "But that's okay," I assured her, holding her hand tightly, "because I'll always be here to help you find them." When the hospital released her weeks later, she returned to the center, stronger and more resolute. The time we spent together became our adventure, and although she would always face difficulties ahead, I learned that teaching her to read was more than just unlocking the door to a book. It had become a bond, an enduring flame even amidst the darkest of storms. And as I watched her walk into that community center, her head held high and her eyes sparkling with determination, I realized that perhaps it was I who had been taught the most. I never thought that a simple camping trip could change my life in such an unexpected way. It was a last-minute decision, spurred by my friend's insistent nudging. After a particularly toxic relationship and an incessant whirlwind of grudges collecting like dust in the corners of my heart, I reluctantly agreed to escape the city's chaos for a weekend of peace and reflection. Little did I know, this trip would become the catalyst for confronting my darkness. We set off to the woods, a small group of 5, the kind of friends that had stuck around through thick and thin, yet I still felt some invisible walls built by past wounds. We hiked for miles, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting eerie shadows through the trees, whispering like the ghost of my past. When we finally reached our campsite, it felt like an oasis from my own life, a chance to really breathe, to let go of the suffocating weight of my grudges. That night, gathered around the flickering campfire, my friends shared stories from their youth, moments where they had been wronged, but also moments of forgiveness. They spoke of letting go, learning to love themselves despite the pain imposed by others. Something stirred inside me, the urgency to wrestle with my own memories. A stillness blanketed the clearing as a chill crept into the air. I became lost in my thoughts, recounting the betrayal of my ex-best friend, the backstabbing move that had left me marred and raw. I hadn't spoken to her in years, and the thought of seeing her still twisted a knife in my gut. My friends noticed my silence, encouraging me to share. Just let it out, one urged, and so I did. I revealed the depth of my resentment, feeling much lighter as each word spilled out. Yet, as I spoke, I couldn't shake the anxiety building in the pit of my stomach. The way the shadows danced around us felt sinister, as if they were feeding off my anger and fears. Just as I was about to sink deeper into my grief, a blood-curdling scream erupted from the depths of the woods, piercing the stillness like a jagged knife. Panic flooded the campsite as we scrambled to our feet, eyes darting wildly in search of the source. My heart raced, my mind racing with possibilities. It had to be an animal, right? Cautiously, we ventured away from the fire, flashes of fear lighting our way as we moved cautiously towards the sound. My friends began calling out to each other, forming a chain of whispered nerves, while I lagged behind, tethered to that suffocating weight. We walked deeper into the trees when I decided to branch off, drawn by an inexplicable pull towards the edge of the clearing. Everything went silent as I approached a dilapidated cabin, half swallowed by vines and thick foliage. Something compelled me to step closer, despite the looming sense of dread creeping up my spine. I felt the familiar bitterness rise up, grudges bubbling to the surface as I thought of all the people who had hurt me. I knocked softly on the door, and to my shock, it creaked open, revealing an interior steeped in shadows and a suffocating atmosphere. As I entered, the air felt thick, pressing down on me, and the door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the eerie noises of the outside world. Then I saw her, my ex-best friend, sitting in the corner, her face obscured by the shadows. My heart thundered as I confronted the apparition of my past. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, anger igniting a fire inside me. She looked up, an expression of despair etched on her face. "I've been waiting for you," she replied, her voice hauntingly familiar, heavy with regret. The darkness of the cabin seemed to pulse around us, the walls vibrating with tension, and in a moment of twisted irony, I realized this was my chance, my opportunity to confront her, to unleash the grudges I had hoarded. But I hesitated. Instead of tearing into her, I was drawn to the pain in her eyes, the sadness that mirrored my own. "Is this real?" I asked, incredulous, heart racing, feeling like I was suspended between two worlds. "This is your truth," she whispered, and suddenly memories washed over me, the laughter, the friendship, the moments before betrayal. Just when I thought I couldn't take it, she started to speak, recounting her own demons, the insecurities, the fear that had led her to sabotage our friendship. And as she spoke, a truth unfurled between us, brighter than the darkness that threatened to consume me. That instant felt like eternity. My grudges began to dissolve like smoke, fragile, ephemeral, revealing the humanity behind the betrayal. I realized I had been holding on to pain like a lifeline, but it was really a weight that dragged me down. Grief turned into empathy, and something in her eyes reflected the soul of someone who had made a grave mistake. I understood then that to truly let go, I had to forgive, not just her, but myself for clinging to the past. The walls of the cabin shimmered with a golden light, expanding with possibility, while the shadows faded away. I reached out, trembling, and she met my hand, our fingers intertwining, sealing the moment between us. The darkness dissipated, and the cabin itself seemed to breathe again. With a deep breath, I finally spoke the words I had resisted for so long: "I forgive you." As those words echoed in the air, a warmth enveloped me. The memories, painful and beautiful, flooded my mind, displaying the entire spectrum of human experience. I stepped back, blinking, until the cabin vanished into the trees, leaving me back in the campsite. My friends stared at me, wide-eyed, as if waiting for me to share, but I was different now, transformed. I felt lighter, finally able to let go of the grudges that had tangled my heart in bitterness. "What happened?" one asked, as I smiled, the warmth of forgiveness burning bright within me. "I learned to let go," I replied, laughter bubbling up, the sound carrying through the night air as we stood united in that moment. I realized that, sometimes, it takes confronting our deepest pain to discover the power of forgiveness. And maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't wait for darkness to find us when the light of understanding is always within our reach. I've always been a person plagued by anxiety. Ever since I was a kid, I felt like there was a suffocating weight on my chest, a constant apprehension that the world around me was one wrong step away from collapsing. My parents dismissed it as a phase, my friends thought it was just part of my introverted nature, but I knew it was more. It wasn't until after college, during a particularly stressful job hunt, that my anxiety transformed into something far darker. It started with insomnia, those relentless nights where every tick of the clock sent my heart racing. The shadows in my room morphed into sinister figures, whispering all my fears back at me. I'd wake up in cold sweats, convinced that something wicked was lurking just beyond the edge of my nightstand. My therapist suggested meditation and mindfulness, but those only seemed to amplify my restlessness. I would sit cross-legged on the floor, focusing on my breath, and soon enough, my breathing would become erratic. Instead of finding calm, I would spiral deeper into a pit of dread. Then came the turning point. One fateful night, after a particularly long day at work filled with endless rejection emails, I threw myself onto the couch and started scrolling mindlessly through a social media feed. That's when I stumbled upon a post about an old abandoned mental institution on the outskirts of town. The post claimed it was haunted, filled with the tormented spirits of patients long gone, and featured eerie photographs that sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, I felt an unsettling thrill. What if I could confront my anxiety in a place that housed its own ghosts? What if I could find a piece of myself amidst the shadows? That's how I ended up driving to that forsaken location the next day. The sun had barely risen when I pulled up to the crumbling structure. Vines crawled up the decaying bricks as if nature were trying to reclaim what man had abandoned. The air was thick with unease, but also with anticipation. I stepped out of my car and took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air touch my skin. I armed myself with a flashlight and pushed open the rickety front door. It creaked like a long-forgotten memory, echoing my own apprehension as I stepped inside. Dust particles danced in the beams of my flashlight, and the smell of mildew wrapped around me like a familiar, yet unsettling embrace. I walked through the darkened corridors, each echo of my footsteps amplifying the racing of my heart. The walls were lined with peeling paint and remnants of old photographs, faces blurred but still staring back at me, eternally frozen in pain. It felt like they were imploring me to understand their stories, as if I were their silent witness. I ventured deeper, negotiating my way through scattered debris, when I heard the faint sound of a child's laughter echoing behind me. I froze. My brain screamed for me to leave, but my feet felt glued to the floor. I turned slowly, my flashlight cutting through the shadows, revealing nothing but emptiness. The laughter ceased, and a chilly breeze swept through the hall, sending a shiver down my spine. My instincts told me to run, yet something within me urged me to stay. I chose to confront what scared me. I sat down in one of the dusty rooms, the remnants of forgotten lives surrounding me. I closed my eyes, focused on my breathing, letting the panic wash over me like a wave. I tried to visualize my anxiety, the feelings of dread, fear, and isolation. Instead of fighting against it, I let it come. It felt like a tidal wave crashing down, but in that moment, instead of succumbing to despair, I envisioned wrapping that wave into a warm blanket. I told my anxiety that it was okay to exist, that it could sit with me for a while. As I opened my eyes, the atmosphere shifted. No longer did I feel like a visitor in a haunt, I felt like a ghost freed from its chains. The shadows no longer loomed menacingly, they had transformed into quiet companions. I stayed there for hours, reminiscing, confronting memories long buried, and releasing thoughts that had once strangled me. The child's laughter returned, this time gentle and soothing, as though it were a reminder that joy still existed beneath the layers of anguish. I realized in that moment that my anxiety wasn't an enemy, it was a part of me, a reflection of my sensitivity and fears. I walked through the halls again, more confidently this time. The whispers felt less like accusations and more like echoes of stories needing to be told. I stopped to touch the old photographs, imagining the lives they once held, the hopes, dreams, and countless battles fought in silence. As the sun dipped in the sky, I made my way back outside, leaving the abandoned institution with a newfound sense of peace. My anxiety hadn't vanished, it was still there, pulsing beneath the surface, but I'd learned to coexist with it. I drove home that night, the sky painted with the warm hues of sunset and my heart lighter than it had been in years. I realized I had confronted the very essence of what once terrified me, the fear of being lost, of being without control. Instead, I found strength in vulnerability, realizing that every ghost we confront teaches us something invaluable. Anxiety was no longer a weight dragging me down, it was a part of my existence, a companion guiding me to find balance in chaos. I wrote this to share not only my journey but to remind others that facing our fears doesn't always mean banishing them. Sometimes, it means inviting them to sit at the table of our lives. Because in doing so, we discover that peace is not the absence of fear, but the ability to embrace it wholeheartedly. When I faced my biggest insecurity and overcame it, I didn't expect it would be such a life-altering experience. It started with an ordinary day, a Friday more specifically, where I was drowning in a sea of anxiety because of a college presentation. You see, I had always struggled with public speaking. The thought of standing in front of my classmates sent chills through my spine, my palms would sweat, and my mind would go blank. As I walked to class that day, I tried to calm my nerves by rehearsing my speech in my head. It was a crucial assignment, and failing was not an option. If I could just deliver this one presentation, I thought, then maybe I'd garner the respect from my peers that I desperately sought. I entered the classroom, and everyone was already seated, chattering amongst themselves. I took my place at the front, feeling the weight of their gazes. My heart raced, and I could feel beads of sweat forming behind my neck. Just as I was about to speak, a loud commotion erupted at the back of the room. I turned my head, trying to see what was happening when the classroom door flew open. In strode a figure shrouded in shadow. I could barely make out their features. It was someone in a jacket, face covered with a hoodie, and they were flanked by two others. Gripped by fear, my mind raced with thoughts. Why were they here? What did they want? My presentation was forgotten in that moment, my nervousness eclipsed by sheer terror. The person in front held their hands up and shouted for us to remain calm. It felt paradoxical, like bad horror movie clichés come to life. The sanctuary that was my classroom had turned into a prison. In that instant, my mind began spiraling, diving into the deep end of every fear plus all the insecurities I'd ever harbored about myself. The intruder began speaking, revealing their intentions. They wanted a social experiment, they claimed, an exploration of fear and how far it could push people, a twisted idea that involved us sharing our deepest insecurities. There were murmurs among the students, a mix of curiosity and disbelief. It felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare. Then, the most unexpected thing happened. Before I even realized it, I stood up. I don't know what possessed me, maybe it was the adrenaline, or perhaps a reckless desire to confront my own fears. I raised my hand, demanding to speak, drawing everyone's attention. If we're going to share, then I'll go first. The room fell silent, shock etched on every face, including that of our uninvited guest. I felt a mixture of dread and exhilaration as I stepped forward. I started revealing my biggest insecurity, my fear of public speaking. I spoke about the sleepless nights, the sweaty palms, and the horrifying thought of failing in front of everyone. As I continued, something shifted within me. The rawness of my admission opened a floodgate I didn't know existed. I shared my history, the countless moments where I had shied away from opportunities because of my fear. As I spoke, something magical happened. Instead of derision or mockery, I saw understanding in my classmates' eyes. They began opening up too, sharing their vulnerabilities, fears, heartbreaks, and failures. It became an impromptu cathartic session, a strange amalgamation of fear and solidarity stitched together in a communal experience. Even the masked figure seemed surprised by the turn of events, their posture loosening in response to the tide of vulnerability sweeping through the room. I felt a sense of empowerment as I spoke, a wave of confidence rolling over me. It was as if this bizarre invasion had become a catalyst for healing. The atmosphere was charged, palpable in ways I couldn't describe. It was no longer about the fear of speaking but an embrace of our collective insecurities. For the first time, I saw my classmates not as potential critics but as people just as scared and lost as I was. I finished my story and took a deep breath, a sense of relief washing over me. In that moment, I realized my biggest insecurity was not the possibility of failure but the fear of being judged, of being vulnerable. As if sensing our moment of unity, the hoodie-wearing intruder nodded, their expression softening. They thanked us for our honesty. It was surreal, knowing that they came with malicious intent, but we had turned the situation on its head. Finally, they turned to leave, the tension in the room dissipating. As they exited, the class erupted in applause. My heart swelled, I had spoken my truth, and I felt lighter than air. I thought that would be the end of the story, a moment of triumph to carry with me for eternity. But then came the notification, a message from an anonymous account on social media titled Vulnerability Chronicles. It was a clip of my presentation stolen from someone's phone, filmed without consent and posted online for the world to see. My heart sank. Instantly, my palms began to sweat again, the horror of judgment washed over me. I read through the comments, and my heart dropped further. Some were kind, expressing admiration for my courage. But others were cruel, mocking me and tearing apart the rawness I had shared. My insecurities came rushing back full force, threatening to consume me whole. I wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. I was back to square one, feeling as if I had exposed myself just to be ridiculed. In my heart, I knew I doubted my journey into vulnerability. That night was torturous. I watched the video again and again, trying to convince myself it didn't matter what strangers thought, they didn't know my story. Yet the insults echoed in my mind, like a mournful refrain, belittling my courage. I realized I had inadvertently given others a weapon against me, and it crushed my spirit. For a few days, I hid away, indulging in the darkness that came from that wave of negativity. But in my solitude, I unraveled. I confronted the harsh reality, this battle was as much internal as it was external. My biggest insecurity wasn't merely my fear of judgment, it was my fear of truly connecting with others. And because I had shared the truth, I uncovered a strange community online rallying behind me, sharing their own fears and struggles ignited by my clip. Surprisingly, this newfound support began to eclipse the mockery. People reached out, sharing their stories of feeling terrified, alone, and vulnerable. I began to see my experience as a ripple effect, a chain reaction sparked by honesty. The comments morphed from a sea of negativity into encouragement, and I finally understood, the true essence of facing my biggest insecurity wasn't about overcoming fear entirely but learning to embrace it. I resurfaced, and with each step forward, every connection I forged through honesty strengthened my journey. I realized vulnerability is a bond, not a weakness. By learning to embrace my fears and expressing them, I found my community. In the end, I did overcome my fear of public speaking. I didn't become perfect, I still stumbled, but now I do so with courage. Remember, facing one's fears opens new doors. So if you feel paralyzed by insecurity, the moment you walk through the fire, you'll find yourself emerging, scarred but more alive than ever, connected in ways you never imagined. I told my story not just for myself, but for those voices still lost in silence. And instead of retreating, I publicly thanked everyone who supported me, embraced my story, and shared their own. Authenticity doesn't just give you strength, it extends a hand to those willing to walk alongside you. So the next time you face your biggest insecurity, know this, the real victory lies in owning your truth. How I faced a major challenge and came out stronger. When I found myself staring down the challenge that would change my life forever, I had no idea just how deeply it would shake me. I had always considered myself a fairly resilient person, able to keep my head up through tough times and carry on even when things felt insurmountable. But this particular challenge was different, and as I stood at the crossroads of it, all my usual self-assurances seemed to slip through my fingers like sand. It all started one cold, gray morning, the kind where the air feels heavy and the clouds settle low over the city. I was sitting in a conference room with the heads of my department, listening to my boss drone on about budget cuts and necessary sacrifices. They were restructuring, they explained, and though they valued my contributions over the years, there was no longer a place for me in the company. Just like that, I went from a steady career to a statistic in a downsizing effort. The initial shock was paralyzing. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The air felt thick, like I was breathing through wool. The first thought that hit me was that I had nothing to fall back on. I'd poured my life into this job, putting in late hours, sacrificing personal time, even skipping vacations. It had all felt worth it because I'd believed I was building something solid, something that would last. But now, as I packed up my office, I realized I was walking out with nothing but a cardboard box of old memos and dusty desk ornaments. The days that followed were a blur of emails, phone calls, and awkward conversations with family and friends. I'd always been the one people could rely on, the stable one, and now I felt like a failure, like I'd let everyone down. Friends tried to be supportive, offering me their condolences, but the pity in their eyes only deepened the shame I felt. I'd spent years building an image of myself that now felt hollow, and the weight of it all felt like it was crushing me. For weeks, I spiraled. Every rejection email hit me like a punch to the gut, and I started questioning everything about myself, my abilities, and my choices. I was used to feeling in control, used to being the person who had it all together, but now I was adrift, lost in a sea of self-doubt. I found myself retreating from everyone, isolating myself because the idea of facing people, of admitting I was struggling, was just too painful. It was around this time that I found an old notebook from years ago, hidden at the back of a closet while I was clearing out clutter. I'd used it during my college days to jot down ideas, dreams, and goals. As I flipped through its yellowed pages, I found a list I'd written on a whim one night, a bucket list of things I'd wanted to do if I'd had more time. Learn photography, climb a mountain, run a marathon, it read. Silly dreams I'd abandoned along the way for more practical goals. But that list ignited something in me, a spark I hadn't felt in a long time. I realized that I'd spent so much of my life focusing on stability and security that I'd never truly challenged myself, never taken the kind of risks that push you to your limits. And maybe, just maybe, losing my job was the universe's way of forcing me to take a chance on something new. Without much thought, I signed up for a marathon. I hadn't run more than a mile since college, but the idea of it felt strangely right, like this was something I needed to do for myself. Training was brutal. I was out of shape, and the first few weeks were painful. My muscles screamed in protest, my lungs burned, and I almost gave up countless times. But every morning, I'd lace up my shoes and push myself a little harder, determined to prove that I could do this, even if only to myself. The training became my therapy, a way to focus on something tangible, something that was in my control. Each run was a battle with my own mind, a test of whether I could keep going even when everything inside me screamed to stop. It was during one of these runs, in the early hours of the morning, that I had a revelation. My life had always been about avoiding failure, about playing it safe and taking the road most traveled. But now, faced with the unknown, with the very real possibility of failure, I realized that I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for. The fear of failure had kept me small, kept me confined within the safe walls of my comfort zone. But now, with every mile I ran, those walls started to crumble. When race day arrived, I stood at the starting line feeling a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I trained for this, pushed myself through months of doubt and pain, and now I was here. The race itself was grueling, far harder than any training run. There were moments when I thought I couldn't go on, when my legs felt like lead and my lungs burned with every breath. But I kept going, step by step, mile by mile, until I crossed that finish line. I remember collapsing on the ground, tears streaming down my face, not from exhaustion but from a deep sense of triumph. I had done it. I had faced my fear, pushed through the pain, and come out stronger. That race taught me something profound, that resilience isn't about never failing, it's about refusing to let failure define you. Losing my job had been devastating, but it forced me to confront the parts of myself I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. It pushed me to find strength I hadn't known I possessed, to rebuild my life on my own terms. In the weeks that followed, I found new clarity. I started pursuing opportunities I'd once dismissed as impractical, reached out to people I admired, and even began freelancing in a field I was passionate about but had never dared to pursue. Life didn't suddenly become easy, but I was no longer paralyzed by fear. I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, I could face them, because I'd faced one of the toughest moments of my life and come out stronger. This journey taught me that sometimes, we have to be broken down to discover the strength we carry within. The challenges we face aren't meant to defeat us, they're there to help us grow, to force us to confront the limits we place on ourselves and shatter them. I'm not the same person I was before, and I'm grateful for it. Because in losing everything, I found myself, and I realized that the only real failure is never trying at all. It was a cold autumn afternoon when I stumbled across an old cookbook in the back of my grandmother's attic. Dust swirled in the slanting sunlight as I gently opened its worn pages, revealing recipes that had long been forgotten, scrawled in a shaky yet elegant handwriting. I had never been particularly fond of cooking. I viewed it as a tedious necessity, always opting for takeout or microwave meals instead. Yet something about this cookbook pulled at me, whispering promises of warmth and comfort. Little did I know, it would lead me down a dark and twisted path I never saw coming. The challenge began innocently enough, a quirky competition my friends and I had concocted over drinks one night. Each participant needed to prepare one dish from the cookbook every week for a month, and the winner would claim a prize. The loser would have to perform their most embarrassing karaoke song in front of the group. Fueled by some bizarre mix of pride and competitiveness, I tossed myself into the challenge. My first attempt was a classic lasagna, complete with homemade sauce, a daunting task for someone like me. The kitchen soon resembled a war zone, ingredients strewn about like casualties. I chopped parsley with shaky hands, anxious that I was butchered it more than finely dicing. Once it was in the oven, I hovered anxiously, praying my culinary rookie mistakes wouldn't end in disaster. To my shock, the lasagna turned out not just edible but genuinely delicious. Cheers erupted around the table when I presented it, and you could almost feel my self-esteem skyrocket. The thrill of cooking had begun to spark within me. Week after week, I tackled new recipes, and what was once a daunting chore became a source of excitement. I made aromatic curries and reinvented desserts that sang with flavor. My friends were impressed, and so was I. But one evening, as I overturned the last slice of a rich chocolate tart onto a platter, the house was filled with a strange, unfamiliar silence. The air felt charged, electric. It was as if the cookbook was whispering to me, urging me to go further, to dive deeper into the realm of culinary creation. I was now lost in the prospect of mastering complex dishes, French soufflés, intricate pastries, you name it. I had become obsessed. I started spending every free moment in the kitchen, experimenting beyond the constraints of our silly challenge. One night, as I was rummaging through the cookbook, a peculiar recipe caught my eye, the Heart of Darkness stew. The name was ominous, accompanied by a disclaimer that warned, for experienced cooks only. Heart pounding with a rush of adrenaline, I decided it was time to test my skills, to prove that I had truly become a master in my own right. The ingredients listed were strange and rare, but I was determined. I trekked across town to collect all the exotic spices and unusual meats. The locals eyed me suspiciously as I grabbed various components, whispering among themselves. I ignored the strange looks, my excitement outweighed their judgments. But once I started cooking, everything felt almost different. The kitchen grew unnaturally dark, shadows flitting across the walls, whispering secrets that made my skin prickle. As I mixed the rich broth, strange visions swirled in my mind, glimpses of culinary masterpieces forming before my eyes, but also fleeting images that sent chills down my spine like a foreboding warning. I pushed those thoughts aside as the boiling pot bubbled, a rich aroma enveloping the air, its depth drawing me in as if it were alive. Ignoring the darker parts of my mind, I poured my heart and soul into this stew, every ounce of passion feeding the pot as it transformed into something mesmerizing. That night, I served the stew to my friends, their eyes darting between the deep, shimmering liquid and me, silently questioning if I had truly mastered the art of cooking or tapped into something far more sinister. As the first spoonful sent them drifting into a trance-like state of bliss, they marveled at the flavor, but their eyes hinted at something deeper, an unspeakable fear. They begged for more, craving the strange dish, and for the first time, I noticed that they no longer appeared as my friends but as something else, hungry, desperate creatures drawn in by something at once magnetic and menacing. Days passed, and our weekly gatherings morphed into fervent rituals where we would ceremoniously indulge in Heart of Darkness stew. We were becoming addicted. Laughter that once echoed in my home turned to sinister whispers around the table, shadows stretched across the walls as disbelief morphed into an overwhelming hunger. The cookbook haunted my dreams, night after night, more recipes emerging from the pages, calling me forth. I became consumed with wanting to create more, each dish rousing deeper cravings from my friends until the lines blurred completely. Then, one night, I discovered a blank page in the cookbook. It felt eerie, a void amidst the rich tapestry of familiar recipes, as if it were a promise of something new. I couldn't resist, my hand moved to jot down a mysterious concoction that burst forth from my obsessions. A devious laugh escaped my lips as I wrote, cementing my transformation from a culinary novice to something inexplicable. But when I presented my latest creation, a terrifying concoction dark as midnight, everything changed. As my friends took their first bites, their faces contorted, not in joy but stark horror. They collapsed to the floor, clawing at their throats as if the very essence of my dish had ensnared them, pulling them into an inescapable void of despair. Panicked, I dropped the serving spoon, realizing I had strayed too far off the path. The cookbook lay open before me, and the remaining pages appeared blank once more, as if it were a sentient being, waiting for me to write my final offering. I fled from the kitchen in terror, my heart racing as the shadows chased me, the whispers bolstered into screams. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had discovered something that should have stayed hidden, that not all joy born in the kitchen comes from sharing food or moments of laughter, but some arise from dark places, consuming everything in their wake. Now, they say every cook must pay a price for what they create. For me, that price was all the friends I lost, consumed by my ambition. To this day, I wrestle with the fragments of my past that echo through the silence of my empty home. If you ever find a dusty cookbook in the attic, please heed my warning, not every recipe is meant to be uncovered. Some should remain buried, hidden in the forgotten corners of time, lest they claim you too. Cooking is no longer a joy for me but a haunting reminder of what I once had, what I lost to the darkness that simmered beneath the surface. I never thought that speaking up for a coworker would change my life forever. It was just another dreary Tuesday at the office, and I was buried in the usual stack of spreadsheets and reports. My cubicle was a confined space, decorated with the obligatory potted plant and a few family photos, all bearing the weight of everyday monotony. I often lost myself in daydreams, wishing for something more than this mundanity. That's when I noticed Sarah, a new hire who had joined the team just a few weeks prior. She was quiet, often keeping to herself, and I could tell that she was struggling to adjust. I felt a strange kinship with her, as if I could see the same flickers of anxiety that haunted me since my first days here. Little did I know, that Tuesday would mark the beginning of a nightmare that transcended everyday office drama. It started during the lunch break. The usual group of coworkers had decided to descend upon the break room, their voices rising and falling like waves crashing against a rocky shore. Sarah was there, sitting alone, her lunch untouched as she stared blankly at her phone. I wanted to approach her, but fear held me back, the same fear that made me hesitant to speak in group settings. Suddenly, Mark, the office joker and self-proclaimed life of the party, launched an attack on Sarah, mocking her for her quietness, her shyness, her lack of backbone. Laughter erupted around the room, the kind that can sting and linger. Sarah's cheeks flushed crimson, and for a moment, I saw the hurt in her eyes. My heart raced as I wrestled with my conscience. It should have been easy to step in, to say something, anything, to defend her. But the anxiety was crippling, like chains wrapping tighter around my chest as I thought of the consequences. I could already hear the whispers, "Look at the new girl, can't even take a joke." But seeing her shrinking onto herself broke something inside me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stood up and shouted, "That's enough, Mark." The laughter died, replaced by shocked silence. You can't just bully someone for being shy. Everyone has their struggles. My voice trembled, but I pressed on, fueled by an unexpected wave of adrenaline. Mark scoffed, his face contorting with mock disbelief. "Oh, come on. It's just a joke." But something shifted in the room. My coworkers looked uncomfortable, some shifting in their seats, glancing between me and Mark. The tension was palpable, and Sarah's eyes shimmered, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. That's when the lights flickered. At first, I thought it was just a power surge typical in our stale, outdated building, but then they dimmed again, and the air turned heavy. A strange groaning noise emanated from the walls, like an omen. I could feel a chill deep in my bones, but I shook it off as paranoia. Mark snickered, trying to regain his footing, but I stood my ground. "Why don't you take a look at yourself instead of tearing others down?" I fired back, feeling braver. By the second, as if maybe I had the power to confront the darkness in this place. Then, just as I sensed a shift in the atmosphere, the lights flickered again and went out entirely. A gasping silence enveloped us, followed by a distant yet chilling laugh that echoed through the darkness. I heard whispers, barely audible, feathery voices that seemed to curl around me. "You should have stayed quiet. You should have remained unseen." Panic spread through the room, and I felt a pull, almost a magnetic force, urging me to run. The voices persisted, growing louder, and I could see faint shadows drifting in the blackness, like dark figures creeping closer. "This is what happens when you confront the herd," they hissed. I glanced at Sarah, and her eyes were wide with fear. "What is happening?" she gasped, caught between heartache and confusion. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just about standing up for her, it was about confronting the darkness that seemed to thrive in this office, feeding on our fears and insecurities. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, piercing through the thick gloom, but the laughter, that horrifying laughter, persisted. "You've disturbed the balance," Mark yelled, his face twisted with an unrecognizable rage. Something deep within me stirred. It was the realization that I had unwittingly unleashed something dark and ancient by choosing to finally speak when silence had been my constant companion. Without thinking, I grabbed Sarah's hand and whispered, "We need to go." As we raced out of the break room, the laughter crescendoed into a cacophony of mocking jeers, echoing off the stark white walls like a damning chorus. It became a twisted hunt. We could hear the gatekeepers of that malicious energy trailing us, the shadows flickering at the corners of our vision. "Don't look back," I shouted, fear fueling our dash down the corridor, through cubicles, past the glaring fluorescent lights, out towards the back exit. But the door wouldn't budge. We slammed against it, panic clawing at our chests. "It's locked," Sarah gasped, breathless. The voices surrounded us, whispering now, weaving tales of fear, of regret. In that moment, I felt something primal growing within me, a fierce fire igniting my resolve. I turned to Sarah, desperate to sound brave. "We won't let them win. Not now." I could feel the shadows thickening, creeping closer, but I had to do something. There was a fire alarm handle just above me. I jumped, pulled the lever, and instantly the blaring sound echoed through the building, puncturing the stillness like a knife. The shadows hesitated, the laughter weak, like air seeping out of a balloon. Sarah grabbed my arm, and for the first time, I saw resolve reflected in her eyes. "Keep going," she urged. The sound brought others into the hallway, confused but drawn by the urgency. As people began pouring out into the corridor, the whispers turned to screams, and the shadows twisted, unraveling into the walls. Somehow, in our collective fear, we had broken the hold that darkness had claimed over us. With that cacophony of screams and alarms, we pushed through the door, tumbling outside into the harsh light. Mark was nowhere to be seen, perhaps he had been swallowed by the shadows. Stand together, I thought, and we'd dispel the darkness that contained us. Looking back, I wasn't just speaking up for Sarah, we had stood up against the very essence of fear that had lingered too long in our place of work. That day changed everything. The office atmosphere shifted, no longer stifled by dread and ridicule. Sarah and I grew close, and together we championed kindness in our workplace, making it a refuge instead of a battleground. But there was a lingering mystery. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I would hear faint whispers in the air, echoes of "You might have won this round, but we're always watching." I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows still lingered, lurking in the fringes of our lives, waiting for just the right moment to strike again. All from the lesson learned that day: courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the determination to act even when that fear seems insurmountable. And sometimes, speaking up puts you in the crosshairs of a darkness you never knew existed. What would you do if you were faced with that choice? I remember the creeping sense of dread as the invite to the group meeting landed in my inbox. This wasn't just any meeting, it was an assembly of my colleagues, a chance to share ideas and strategies. It had become a notorious focal point of whispered office gossip. Too many had walked in with confidence, only to come out looking like lost souls, drowned in a sea of skepticism and critique. I'd spent weeks mentally rehearsing talking points, but as the day approached, the heart of my voice was drowning beneath anxiety. It felt as if everyone else had a microphone while I struggled with a whisper. The day arrived. It was a chilly Thursday afternoon when we gathered in the conference room, glassy-eyed. I took my seat among more seasoned employees, their confidence palpable. They chatted casually, a practiced ease hanging in their laughter. And there I was, the quiet one, the outsider looking in. What could I possibly contribute? A few moments into the meeting, the facilitator, Mark, a man known for his booming presence, proposed we each share our thoughts about a new project. My palms began to sweat. My heart raced. I shuffled in my seat, rehearsing my lines yet again, searching for the courage to speak. One by one, my colleagues spoke, and I tried to absorb their words, but each one washed over me like a tidal wave. Striking words flew like darts, comments sharp as knives. I felt a lump in my throat, choking down my unease. The more they spoke, the tighter the grip of fear became. I wanted to scream, "I am here. I have ideas too." My thoughts screamed louder than my words ever could. Each voice cut through the air, vibrant and strong, while I remained still, drowning in the depths of self-doubt. Suddenly, it was my turn. I could feel every eye in the room, the weight of their stares pressing against me, and I froze. Nothing but white noise flooded my mind, a cacophony of self-loathing almost deafening. That's when I noticed the flickering light above me, barely perceptible. I blinked and tried to focus on my colleagues seated around the polished table, but it was as if a veil came down, isolating me in my turmoil. My heart was thundering as I felt the flicker turn into a flicker of something like hope. Amidst this dreadful overshadow of anxiety, something primal ignited within me. Perhaps it was desperation, or maybe the need to reclaim my space, to be heard amidst the chaos. The flickering light suddenly expanded in my mind, illuminating the darkness where my fears festered. As if propelled by some unseen force, my lips parted, and what came spilling out was unexpected. I believe we could approach this project by focusing on the user experience more intimately. The words flowed, uncoiling like a spring after being compressed for too long, a sudden burst of sound in the silence that followed my initial statement. I noticed the surprised glances, a few heads nodding, maybe they were listening, maybe I hadn't been voiceless after all. Encouraged by their attention, I continued, weaving in ideas I had tucked away for so long, concepts I believed could breathe life into the project. They took me seriously, and I could see the wheels turning in their heads. I felt a shift within the room, a tangible energy igniting as I spoke. It was like a dark cloud lifting, casting light in every corner of my mind. When I finished, I sat back as if I'd just leapt from a dizzying height, the adrenaline rushing through me. The room was lively now, discussions sparking like fireworks. My heart was still racing, but in a thrilling way. Suddenly, I wasn't the outsider anymore, I belonged in that vibrant exchange of ideas. As the meeting progressed, I found myself being called upon to share more. The flickering light that had emerged in the midst of my fear now shone brightly with each positive exchange. When the meeting concluded, Mark approached me, a genuine smile on his face. "Great insights today," he said, and I felt an unexpected rush of warmth envelop me, validation, a recognition of my presence, my voice. As I left the conference room, I couldn't stop smiling. I realized the darkness hadn't entirely vanished, it still lurked in the corners of my mind, but I had taken a step towards illumination. The moment I found my voice didn't come from a place of perfection but rather a willingness to confront the shadows that threatened to keep me silent. That day, I stepped into the realm of the expressive, and it felt like a birth of fortitude within me. I left that meeting not just with my ideas validated but invigorated by the idea that I could reclaim my narrative. In the following weeks, I continued to speak up, each moment I took the chance to share becoming a thread in the tapestry of my newfound confidence. I heard laughter and shared insights with my colleagues, their initial judgment fading into acceptance. I understood now that the flickering light was not just a fleeting moment, it was a personal revolution. I was finally part of the collective rhythm instead of just existing in its shadow. As time went on, others began to approach me too, those who had once been too shy to share their thoughts, drawing inspiration from the changes they saw in me. The office morphed into a safe space for dialogue, ideas flourishing instead of wilting beneath the weight of judgment. I realized that finding one's voice is a journey uniquely stripped of absolutes. It's about embracing vulnerability, silencing the fear-mongering thoughts, and finding strength in expression. It's a powerful act of defiance against the silence, against the expectations written gingerly on the scroll of societal constraints. Where I had once felt like an intruder in that room, I now understood what it meant to be a part of something bigger, a flourishing symphony of voices each playing their role. The moment I found my voice in that group setting didn't just echo in that one meeting, it resonated throughout everything I did afterward. Not just for me, but for others too. In the heart of fear, we can find not just our voice but a chorus echoing back at us, reminding us that we are never truly alone. Sometimes all it takes is embracing our flickering lights to illuminate the world around us. I still remember the chill that crept down my spine that evening, even now, writing this almost a year later. I had just finished a long day at work and was trudging my way home, my mind clouded with thoughts of deadlines and bills. It was during this mundane walk, filled with the noise of passing cars and distant chatter, that I met the old man. He was sitting on a bench in the park, a worn-out newspaper resting on his lap, though I suspect he hadn't read it for quite some time. His gray beard was scraggly, his clothes tattered but clean. I didn't intend to talk to anyone, hell, I didn't even want to talk to myself. But there was something about the way he looked up at me, piercing green eyes filled with a blend of wisdom and sorrow, that pulled me in. As I walked past, he called out, "Hey, young one, can I share a secret with you?" Honestly, I almost kept walking, but something in the urgency of his tone stopped me. I hesitated, turned around, and sat down on the edge of the bench. "You won't regret it," he said, a faint smile creeping across his weathered face. His voice was raspy, like an old vinyl record, but oddly comforting. I was curious, I had no plans but to get home, and I wanted to hear what this stranger had to say. He began recounting a story that made my heart race. "You know," he said, "life isn't exactly as it appears. A curtain separates reality from illusion." At that moment, I thought he was simply delusional, an old man with wild notions. But the way he spoke, laced with emotion and nuance, felt like a challenge. I leaned in closer. He told me about a time in his life when he'd lost his wife, how he had fallen into a deep well of despair, and how he had begun to see shadows that whispered truths about his life. Within those shadows, he continued, reside the echoes of our choices, the forks in our journey. Intrigued, I asked him what he meant, and he leaned back, his eyes narrowing as if he were tapping into a reservoir of ancient wisdom. Every decision you make sends ripples through the fabric of your reality. You might think you are walking a straight path, but there are infinite branches along the way. It only takes one conversation to change everything. He pointed in the distance, where the last rays of sunset were fighting to hang onto the horizon. "That sun is just a reflection of what you can become," he said. I wasn't sure where this was going, but I could feel a kind of electric tension building up between us. "You ever met someone who changed your life?" he asked. I shrugged, considering. In truth, I had faced a series of monotonous relationships, friendships that faded just like my unmanicured nails grow dull over time. Hearing his question made me realize I hadn't really connected with anyone in quite some time. "In a way," I replied finally, "but nothing like this." And he smiled again, that knowing smile, one that suggested there was more to what I was saying than I realized. He looked at me intently, then "Let me open your eyes." And just like that, the mood shifted. It was as if the air itself had changed, heavy with the scent of potential unknowns. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "I'm not talking about a serendipitous encounter. I'm talking about a reckoning." It sounded dramatic, a phrase out of a film, but the way he said it sent shivers through me. The other night, I made a terrible choice. There was a man who asked for help, and I turned him away. That very night, he died. I didn't know him, yet I felt his spirit tugging at me. I had a choice, and I chose indifference. My breath caught. Since then, I've spent every evening here, the guilt gnawing at me like a rat in a pantry. Then he gripped my arm, so fiercely that I could feel his weathered fingers digging into my skin. "Young one, every moment wasted is a moment gone forever." One conversation could have changed his life. It could have saved mine. I sat in stunned silence. I could hardly grasp what he was saying, the gravity of his confession was almost too much to bear. The weight of his sorrow seemed to envelop me, a powerful force that hung in the air. I thought of my own life. The missed opportunities, the people I'd brushed aside. Would someone someday sit on a bench and wait for me to wish I had said something different? After a moment of contemplation, I asked him why he was telling me this. The old man's eyes glistened as he gazed at the sunset, now dipping beneath the horizon. "Because you're at a crossroads," he whispered, as if divulging a sacred secret. "You have the chance to choose differently." I glanced at my watch, realizing that I was running late, that I had to get home. Suddenly, the thought of returning to my mundane routine made me feel suffocated. "What if I don't?" I asked, half curious, half terrified. The man smiled knowingly. "Then you'll continue down a path that leads to regret, just like I did." I didn't want to be like him. Suddenly, it felt overwhelmingly important to seize that night for what it was, a nudge toward awakening. For a brief moment, I had the urge to tell him that I would change, that I would reach out to those I had neglected. And it was an odd feeling, taking responsibility for my own choices. But as those thoughts churned, the old man stood up slowly, stretching his limbs as if breaking away from a spell. "Remember," he said, looking me dead in the eyes, "you have no idea how far-reaching one random conversation can be. And just like that, he wandered away, fading into the darkness, leaving me alone on that bench, the city buzzing with life around me. As I sat there, a knot twisted in my stomach, I felt as if I had been handed a brush to rewrite my own narrative. Days turned into weeks, and I reflected constantly on our conversation. I began reaching out to friends I hadn't talked to in years, reconnecting with family members. I volunteered at local charity events, even helping strangers on the streets. I felt alive for the first time in what seemed like forever. Yet, just when I thought everything was settling into a brighter day, a chilling memory surfaced like a phantom. One night, while enjoying a drink in a quiet bar, I overheard a conversation filled with laughter and camaraderie. Suddenly, the last two words stood out, that man. I turned, and my heart dropped. They were talking about a tragedy that had occurred not far from the park. It was late when they output a last gasp of laughter and I heard one say, "What was his name?" "That old man who always talked about choices." The words hung in the air like a cloud of dread. A chill ran through my spine when I realized I could decipher who the man was, and that conversations I wished I had saved might have been the last opportunity to alter his fate. Days later, I returned to that empty park, feeling hollow. Though I'd changed my life dramatically, I often wondered if my transformations were hollow echoes past the limbs of time. As I stared at the empty bench, the weight of my choices pressed down on me. I realized now, I had to do more. Conversations are not just about life, they're about depth, connections that run far beyond surface interactions. I stood up, the air heavy with unresolved futures. And as the sun dipped once more beneath the horizon, I whispered a promise, not just to myself, but to those shadows of lost moments. I would not let my chance slip again. I'm telling you all this because life is fleeting, strange, and infinitely connected through conversations, whether with old men on park benches or with someone you think you know. You never know which chat or choice could tether you to a destiny you never imagined. So please, engage deeply with life. Cherish every word, every glance. Because once they slip away, you may not have the chance to whisper a change. And believe me, your own life may be depending on it. When I learned the importance of giving back to the community, it wasn't because I had a life-changing epiphany or a sudden urge to volunteer. It was a chilling experience that I still can't fully rationalize. It was a chilly October evening, and I was trudging home from another dreary day at my dead-end job. My mind was consumed by thoughts of my upcoming bills and the empty fridge that awaited me. As I walked, a flickering streetlight cast eerie shadows on the ground, but I brushed off the feeling of dread that crept up my spine. I rounded the corner and saw a small crowd gathered near the park. A few minutes of curiosity led me over. They were mingling around an old, rickety van parked beside the playground. A faded sign read "The Kindness Project." Intrigued, I stepped closer. Volunteers handed out sandwiches, hot coffee, and blankets to a dozen or so people who looked like they had nowhere else to go. As I watched, something started to shift within me. I felt a pull to do something. I had never volunteered before, but that day, something inside me cracked open. My first instinct was to walk away, but the sight of a young boy, no more than 7, wearing a thin jacket made me hesitate. His eyes were wide and innocent as he clutched a steaming cup of hot cocoa. I couldn't believe I was about to walk away from this moment, but the tears that pooled in his wide eyes snagged on my heart. I slipped off my jacket, walked up to the volunteer, and handed it over. "Here," I said, "give this to him." The volunteer nodded gratefully, and I felt a warm swell in my chest, but it quickly vanished as I turned to head home. That moment was the catalyst for what I thought would be a small change in my life. Over the next few weeks, I began to volunteer with the Kindness Project. Each Saturday, I'd help serve meals, organize donations, and listen to stories of those who had fallen on hard times. It lifted my spirits in a way I never imagined. I got to know the regulars, from the elderly woman who always brought her beloved dog, Scruffy, to the teenager who had aspirations of being an artist but found himself homeless after family troubles. They had their struggles and hopes. I learned about resilience and the strength of the human spirit. I felt alive, like I finally mattered. But one gloomy evening, something felt off. The air was thick with tension. The volunteers, who were usually so lively, whispered amongst themselves anxiously. I overheard bits and pieces about someone who had been coming around, someone unsettling. They spoke of a middle-aged man with a piercing gaze. He was new, reportedly asking strange questions and darting his eyes from person to person as if he was searching for something, or someone. My gut churned, but I shook it off. I dealt with tough situations before, and I wasn't about to let a man's unsettling presence scare me away from the good things happening in our little community project. I was serving soup that night when he approached me. His eyes locked onto mine with a fervor that made me shiver. "What do you think you're doing?" he rasped, tilting his head. "Giving back," I replied, trying to sound confident, but I could feel my voice quiver. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can make a difference? You think these people will ever change?" His breath reeked of cigarettes and whiskey, and I took a step back. "Every little bit helps," I told him, forcing a smile. "You shouldn't come here, you don't belong," he said, voice low and menacing. I didn't want to provoke him, I only wanted to help. "I'm just helping out," I managed to say. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "You want to help? You'll learn the true cost of giving back soon enough." That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning as his words echoed in my mind. The next week, the Kindness Project was buzzing with excitement. We had a big fundraiser planned, and it took all our efforts to prepare for it. Just as I was starting to feel this was a good decision, the unsettling man from last week appeared. This time, he was standing away from the crowd, a shadow lurking at the edge of the streetlight's reach, merely watching. It sent chills down my spine. The event went off without a hitch despite my growing unease. People flooded in, donations flooded in, it felt triumphant. But as the night went on, I noticed fewer people around as the clock ticked on, and only a handful of volunteers stayed behind with me to pack up. I was helping gather old chairs when I heard a commotion outside. It drew me outside, heart pounding in my chest. That man was gone, but the darkness of his warning had somehow seeped into the event. Panic spread among us as we realized one of our regulars, an elderly man named Tom, had gone missing. We checked the nearby alleyways, calling his name, voices laced with fear. Moments felt like hours until one of the other volunteers gasped, pointing. "Over there." The shape of a body lay slumped at the edge of the park, near the shadows where that man had stood earlier. I couldn't breathe. We rushed over as my heart dropped. Tom lay unconscious, barely breathing, with bruises forming on his neck. A sickening dread swallowed me. I remembered the man, his eyes glimmering with malice. The paramedics arrived just in time to help Tom, but his absence became a constant in our volunteering work. He was missed, and I felt guilt gnawing at my conscience because I wondered if I could have prevented it somehow. That man had been right, the price of giving back felt steep, and I began to sense the darkness lurking. Weeks passed, and I kept showing up despite the heavy sensation of dread clinging to my chest. The community was resilient, but I started seeing shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. You'd hear murmurs of people saying the man had been spotted more often, lurking, but they would dismiss it like a ghost story. My gut told me that this was more than just a tale. I couldn't shake my fear as events grew darker. On a particularly dreary evening, I was closing up the community center when I noticed him again. He stood at the end of the parking lot, his gaze locked on me. Just like before, he made no move but watched, and within that moment, I felt exposed, as if he could see straight into my soul. I turned to leave, but the moment I stepped outside, I felt an unbearable weight settle over me. It was then the realization struck hard, it wasn't just some man. He was a ghost of all my failures, all my self-interests laid bare. I had started giving back to make myself feel better but forgot about those I was meant to uplift. I decided then, I needed to confront him, to understand what this ordeal meant. Bursting with fear, I shouted into the dark, challenging him to approach. "What do you want?" His laughter curled through the air, derisive and echoing. "I want you to understand the true cost of your charity," he said. "Your giving back isn't altruism, it's self-serving. If you genuinely cared, you wouldn't let fear guide you." My heart raced, but deep down, I knew he was right. I took a step forward, feeling the dread lift slightly. "Then tell me what I can do differently," I demanded. He merely smirked and vanished into thin air. My grasp of the situation began to shift. It wasn't him who haunted me but my inner battles. I understood that if I truly wanted to give back, I needed to embrace vulnerability, risk, and acknowledgement of failure, rely on others and let them lean on me. From that night, I dedicated myself to serving our community in a new light. It was messy, uncomfortable, but I also found deep connections with those I aimed to aid. Giving back wasn't about showing how good I was, it became about standing in solidarity with the people, embracing our shared humanity. And when I look back at that haunting figure, I see him now, not as a specter of fear but rather a reminder of the old me, the one who feared connection, who thought giving was only about acts and numbers. I learned that to give back isn't just about generosity, it's learning to be present, genuine, and allow others the space to rise alongside those who lend their hands. Now, I stand firm, knowing that the most essential part of giving back is not the act itself but the transformation that unfolds through it. I hadn't touched my guitar in nearly a decade. It sat in the corner of my room, a relic of my teenage years, collecting dust and nostalgia. Back then, music was everything to me. I spent countless nights strumming away, creating melodies that echoed the intensity of young love and heartbreak. But life happened. Responsibilities took over, and slowly but surely, my joy was suffocated beneath the weight of adulthood. I convinced myself I had outgrown it, convinced myself music was just a fleeting hobby. Then, last month, my grandmother passed away. She was my biggest supporter, the one who always believed I had something special with my music. After the funeral, a wave of grief washed over me, followed by anger. It was as if her death stripped me of my apathy, revealing a chasm where my passion used to thrive. I found myself raiding her old attic, searching for something, anything, that would reignite that lost fire. I uncovered a dusty, tattered journal filled with handwritten lyrics, poems, and ideas. As I thumbed through the pages, a familiar pang of longing washed over me. The words were raw, reflective. They were me. Inspired, I picked up my guitar for the first time since she passed. The strings felt foreign under my fingers, the act felt like reaching into an empty void, but I pressed on, determined. One night, while I was strumming aimlessly, I stumbled upon a haunting melody that seemed to just flow out of me, mingling with the lyrics from my grandmother's journal. I felt alive. I recorded the impromptu song on my phone, played it back repeatedly, drowning in the harmony of grief and creativity. Days turned into weeks, and I started to delve deeper into that creative well I thought had run dry. I played more, wrote more, and poured my heart into every note, resurrecting an old passion, which I discovered wasn't just about music, but the connection to my grandmother. I decided to perform at an open mic night in our small town, nervously signing up for a slot. The night was filled with talented musicians and a buzz of excitement. My palms were sweaty, my heart racing as I sat waiting for my turn. I listened to others pour their souls into their performances, some with stories like mine. When it was finally my turn, the room fell silent. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on me. I took a deep breath, strumming the first chords of that haunting melody I created. As I sang the first verse, I could see a spark of recognition in the crowd, a growing connection. I could almost see my grandmother's smile in the faces of those listening, hear her clapping in spirit, encouraging me. The song ended, and for the first time in years, the applause didn't make me cringe, it filled me with warmth. I stepped off the stage exhilarated, ready to run, to embrace whatever came next. But what happened next twisted my euphoria into darkness. The moment I got home, I noticed something strange. My journal lay open on my desk, pages flipping as if by an invisible hand. It wasn't the wind, I was sure of it. I approached cautiously, heartbeat quickening, inexplicably drawn to the sight. As I reached for it, it slammed shut. The sudden movement sent a shiver down my spine. I opened it again, only to find more entries had appeared. They were in my grandmother's handwriting, familiar yet unnerving. They detailed events that hadn't happened yet, enigmatic musings about music and loss, themes increasingly entwined with my own. Panic settled in quickly, but curiosity clawed at me just the same. Was this some trick my mind was playing? A way of grasping onto her memory? I couldn't help but read. Each day, I became more immersed in the journal, frantically scribbling notes, trying to understand these premonitions that felt so eerily real. The lyrics began to echo in my mind more insistently, almost as if they were beckoning me to play, to explore the emotion imbued within each word. The songs became darker, heavier, laced with sadness that was becoming almost palpable. A few nights later, while playing these new songs, I started to feel something, an energy that pulsed around me, almost tangible, a presence that felt familiar. It was intoxicating, yet terrifying. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was channeling something beyond myself. One evening, while I worked on a particularly morose ballad, the lights flickered violently, followed by an intense drop in temperature. I looked around, confusion flooding my mind. I could have sworn I heard her voice, clear and melodic, whispering encouragement, "Keep going." Heart pounding, I continued playing, pouring everything into the song. The piano keys danced as if possessed, harmonizing with my metal-stringed guitar, a jarring yet beautiful duet resonating through the room. As I played the last note, silence fell. The air was thick with anticipation before everything went dark. When I came to, it was morning. I was curled up on my living room floor next to my equipment, guitar still clutched in my arms. Confusion clouded my mind, but a chill ran down my spine. My phone was lit up with notifications, my social media flooded with messages thanking me for an incredible performance. I was bewildered. I hadn't played for anyone except those few fleeting moments at the mic, had I? But the comments were real: fans, friends, people I didn't even know were saying my music had touched them. They spoke of the raw emotion, the connection to loss and longing. It was as if I had shared a song that was meant for everyone, not just me. Days turned into an avalanche of messages and encouragement. I was thrust into a world of music I thought I had abandoned, and it took my loss to tie me to a community I had long ignored. I slowly contended with what this all meant: my performances, the inexplicable connection to my grandmother, the chilling energy surrounding me. Was it her spirit feeding my creativity, or was it merely my mind navigating the grief? But with each note played and each song penned in her journal, I felt strong. My passion reignited with suffocating intensity, teaching me a lesson in resurrection, that there is beauty even amidst the deepest sorrow. It transformed my pain into art, a testament to love's enduring nature, especially within the realm of music. Though her voice had faded, it left behind echoes, leading me home. I rediscovered my passion, and with that rediscovery came a connection to others, a reminder that love and music, no matter how separated we are by time, can always bring us back together. So here I am now, grateful for the haunting journey that led me back to my heart, intertwined with meaningful notes and lyrics that tell our stories, hers and mine. My grandmother taught me more than music. She taught me the essence of connection and expression, and for that, I will forever strum on, one haunting melody at a time. It was late November when the unthinkable happened. I had been living a relatively mundane life, working a dead-end job at a local convenience store while dreaming of bigger things. One evening, after a long shift, I walked home late, the chill in the air biting through my jacket. As I approached my apartment, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked suspiciously close to the entrance. My intuition screamed at me, but I brushed it off as paranoia. I stepped inside, locked the door, and the dull hum of television filled the silence of my small living space. Just as I settled onto the couch with a cup of tea, suddenly, my phone buzzed violently. A text from my older brother: "Alex, read, get out. Now." Confused and slightly panicked, I called him back, but all I got was his voicemail. I decided to ignore him. He was always the overprotective one. I shrugged it off and turned on Netflix, trying to distract myself from the looming sense of dread. But when a loud bang shattered the quiet, I knew something was seriously wrong. My heart raced as I tiptoed towards the door, peering through the peephole. There they were, two men in black hoodies, their faces obscured, pacing back and forth beneath the flickering porch light. I quickly dialed 911, but as I did, the lights flickered off. A strange, unsettling calm filled the room as I crouched behind my couch, phone trembling in my hands. I didn't dare breathe, every muscle in my body tense with fear, listening to the muffled voices outside. "We'll find you, kid. You can't hide forever," one of them growled, sending chills down my spine. Suddenly, my phone pinged with a notification, the flashlight illuminating the darkness around me. In that moment of panic, I quickly shut it off, praying they hadn't noticed. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the footfalls fade away, the shadows receding. Heart still pounding, I moved towards the window, catching a glimpse of the men speeding away in their car. I quickly checked my texts, realizing Alex had sent several frantic messages, desperate to make sure I was safe. Shaking, I finally responded to him and dropped my phone on the couch, and that's when I noticed the strange object wedged beneath my coffee table. Pulling it out, I found a small, ornate lockbox. It looked ancient, like something pulled from the depths of a forgotten attic. It was locked, no key in sight. Against my better judgment, I decided to pry it open with a butter knife, curiosity overwhelming the fear lingering in my chest. The moment the box clicked open, a strange energy pulsed through the air. It was as if time itself held its breath. Inside, wrapped in tattered velvet, was a small, beautifully crafted dagger, glinting in the dim light. Unease washed over me, but I felt an irresistible urge to hold it. As I gripped the hilt, visions flared in my mind, flashes of the men outside, snarling and menacing. I was filled with a sensation I can't quite articulate. It was like strength and fear, intertwined. The air turned thick as the front door rattled violently, prompting me to rush to the closet and conceal myself, dagger still in hand. I could hear the men screaming, hurling insults and threats at one another, arguing who should go first inside. Their chaotic voices mixed with the pounding of my heart, creating the most unsettling symphony I ever had the misfortune to endure. Just then, I felt a sudden surge. The dagger pulsed in my hand, almost alive, directing my thoughts. If I wielded it well, I could control the narrative of this night. I waited until the door swung open and two shadows flooded into my apartment. In a moment that felt like a cruel slow motion, I sprang from my hiding place, dagger glistening in the dim light. With a guttural roar, I charged at them. Everything felt surreal, as if I were a spectator to my own actions. The energy embraced me, shielding me, lending me its power. I lunged at the nearest man, a guttural scream tearing from my throat. My instincts took over, and I didn't hesitate. He stumbled back, and his companion abruptly turned, wide-eyed in horror. The dagger gleamed, and in that instant, I saw not just these intruders, but the shadows of my past. Every time I felt powerless, every sleepless night worrying about my future, every glimpse of defeat that taunted me. The fear was gone, replaced by an indomitable will to protect what was mine. As the first man collapsed, clutching his side, I pushed forward, adrenaline coursing through me. The second man fumbled for a weapon, but I was too quick, grabbing his wrist and twisting until he cried out. The dagger found purchase once more, and suddenly, the room was drowning in silence. I stood there, chest heaving, the adrenaline fading, the weight of the dagger heavier than ever. I dropped it, stepping away from the chaos, realizing they were gone. They were merely ghosts now, remnants of a fight I never intended to have. I called 911, voice steadier than I thought possible. The authorities arrived just in time to take the two men away. I handed them the dagger, sharing the whole ordeal. What I thought was a dark twist had turned into an empowering experience. The fear dissipated, replaced by strength. I realized that sometimes, what seems like a negative experience can become an opportunity for transformation. After that night, I found a new direction. I enrolled in self-defense classes, learned to channel my fear into strength, and even quit my dead-end job, pursuing a career that I genuinely found fulfilling. I don't know where that dagger came from or what energy bound me to it, but I do know this: when faced with darkness, it is our choices in those moments that shape who we become, not the darkness itself. And perhaps that strange lockbox was just a diversion, a moment to redirect my life. So, if you ever find yourself facing fear, remember, within every dark experience lies the potential for transformation. I used to live a life that many would consider ideal. I had a steady job in advertising, a small but comfortable apartment in the city, and weekends that were filled with dinners, drinks, and the generic hustle of urban existence. But deep down, every time I stared at my reflection in the mirror while brushing my teeth each morning, I felt a growing emptiness. Talk of promotions and bonuses did little to excite me. I was like a puppet in a corporate play, and I had grown weary of the strings pulling me toward a future I didn't want. It wasn't until one fateful evening, after a night out with friends, that I decided to take a leap of faith that would change everything. It all began when I stumbled upon an old friend, Sam, at the bar. Sam had always been the adventurous type, and over the years, he'd shifted from his predictable desk job to pursue a career in wildlife photography. He regaled us with tales of his expeditions into the wild, the breathtaking landscapes, and captivating encounters with majestic creatures, and while I was captivated by the allure of his stories, I felt a bubbling sense of jealousy. I longed for that freedom and passion but had resigned myself to a life of spreadsheets and deadlines. As the night wore on and the alcohol loosened our tongues, I half-jokingly wondered aloud if I should ditch my career and join him on his next adventure. Why not? He laughed. It's never too late to follow your dreams. I brushed it off at first, but the seeds of that idea took root in my mind like a stubborn weed. Over the following weeks, I couldn't shake the thought. During monotonous meetings, I pictured myself standing in lush forests or atop rugged mountains instead of balding conference tables. I spent late nights researching wildlife photography, poring over equipment, techniques, and online courses. I felt a dull drumming in my chest that begged me to act. One day, in the heat of a moment fueled by frustration, I gathered my courage and typed out my resignation letter. It felt surreal as I watched my fingers pound away on the keyboard, each click echoing a growing sense of liberation. The moment my boss received my letter, a mix of disbelief and disappointment washed over his face, and I felt a twinge of guilt, but the excitement quickly replaced it. I was free. I spent the next few weeks immersing myself in photography. I invested all my savings into a decent camera, gear, and classes, devouring every scrap of information I could find. A strange sense of purpose enveloped me as I ventured into parks, forests, and wildlife reserves, camera in hand. The learning curve was steep, but I reveled in it. I fell in love with the quiet moments of waiting, sometimes for hours, just to capture an eagle in flight or the rustle of a deer in the brush. I posted my photos online, and to my surprise, they started to gain traction. The thrill of receiving likes and compliments was intoxicating. Within a year, I had built a modest following, enough to justify the idea of going professional. Things seemed to be looking up. Then, on a chilly autumn day during one of my routine shoots, everything changed. I was in a particularly remote area of the national park, waiting for the golden hour when I heard rustling in the nearby shrubs. I steadied my camera, heart pounding with anticipation. What emerged was a beautiful but distressed fox, looking disheveled and far too thin for this time of year. My instincts kicked in, he was in trouble. I continued to take photos of the fox, but the little creature seemed more curious than frightened. I cautiously approached him, my heart racing, hoping I could help. As I closed the distance, something stirred in the underbrush, a malevolent shadow that made my blood run cold. I hadn't noticed the larger predator lurking nearby, a wolf, emerging from the trees with hungry eyes. In that moment, survival instincts kicked in. I raised my camera like a shield and began to back away slowly, but the wolf had fixated on the vulnerable fox. As panic surged within me, I realized I was in over my head. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. I took a leap of faith, fueled by blind desperation and hoping instinct would guide me. I started shouting loudly, waving my arms, anything to draw the wolf's attention away from the fox. The wolf paused, its ears flicking toward me, but it calculated its options and hesitated. I could see the tension in the air, the sharp contrast between predator and prey. Feeding off my adrenaline, I began to sprint away, creating distance between myself and the fox. The wolf's instincts kicked in, and it lunged after me instead, its growl echoing through the trees, but I kept running, hoping that my act of bravery would give the fox enough time to escape. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I suddenly remembered my camera was still clutched tightly in my hand. I clamped it against my side and sprinted with all my might. As I glanced back, I caught a glimpse of the fox slipping away into the underbrush, and for a moment, I dared to believe I'd saved him. My focus slipped back to my own escape as I darted toward my vehicle parked in the distance. Just when I thought I had narrowly gained the upper hand, I felt a jolt as the wolf lunged, his teeth barely grazing my pant leg. It snapped at me, snarling, and I stumbled, fear paralyzing me for a moment. But I managed to push myself off the ground, racing toward my car, heart pounding like thunder in my ears. When I slammed the door behind me, I felt a surge of relief and disbelief wash over me. I glanced back through the window just in time to see the wolf lose interest and trot off into the trees. I took a deep breath, heart still racing, and thought about that fox. It had been a horrifying experience, but it made me realize that sometimes taking leaps of faith doesn't just manifest in career choices. Soon after, I decided to shift my narrative in the storytelling aspect of my photos. I didn't want to just capture images, I wanted to share the stories of the wild, to illustrate the struggles animals face in a world encroached upon by humanity. I used social media not just for likes but to educate others about wildlife conservation, sparking collaborations with environmental organizations. My work flourished in unexpected ways. I was invited to speak at events, join panels, and even publish a book showcasing the beauty and vulnerabilities of wildlife. That leap of faith, which once felt so fleeting and foolish, had transformed my life in ways I hadn't imagined. It pushed me into a new realm where my voice mattered, where I could make a difference. And as I look back on that moment, I can't help but feel gratitude for that wolf, for if it hadn't chased me, I might have never found the courage to chase my own wild dreams. I've hesitated to share this story, and now that I'm putting it into words, my fingers tremble as I type. I work as a night shift manager in an old factory that produces a variety of parts for automotive manufacturers, and let me tell you, after dark, this place is haunted, not by ghosts but by something far worse. It started about a month ago. We had a new hire, a guy named Derek. At first, he seemed harmless, a little quiet, maybe even a bit withdrawn, but that didn't raise any red flags at first. What caught my attention was the way he worked. Day in and day out, he would stay focused on the assembly line, not bothering to socialize, not even looking up when I walked by. The rest of the crew would clock out, swap stories, or joke around, but Derek was like a phantom, a shadow wandering through the factory floor, and as days turned into weeks, I noticed things about him that made me uncomfortable. The lights in the factory are dim after hours, flickering occasionally, but every night I'd find Derek pulled away from his station, staring blankly at the darkened corner of the room, as if he were waiting for something. I remember vividly one evening, I approached him because he hadn't moved for what felt like ages, and as I got closer, I noticed a thin layer of sweat on his brow. "Hey, you all right?" I asked, trying to gauge where his mind was. He turned to me, and his eyes were wide, almost feverish, like he was half awake from a nightmare. "Did you hear that?" he asked in a whisper, glancing toward the shadows. "Hear what?" I replied. He shook his head and went back to his work. I shrugged it off, thinking it was typical night shift fatigue. However, things didn't get better. The factory started to feel different, people were on edge, whispering rumors that something lurked in the darkness. I dismissed it as mere superstition until I noticed more peculiar behaviors. One night in particular, during our typical shift review, a couple of employees mentioned the strange noises, rattling, whispers that seemed to echo from the walls, but those were just the shadows playing tricks, I thought. Or maybe Derek was just getting under everyone's skin. I tried to ignore it, but then it escalated. A week later, some machinery malfunctioned. It was a huge deal. In our line of work, machinery mishaps, especially during night shifts, can lead to severe accidents. I was called immediately to the scene, and you won't believe what I saw. When I arrived, the lights were flickering aggressively, and Derek stood alone, somehow managing to look both terrified and entranced. The assembly line had gone haywire, parts scattered everywhere, and I had to scream my orders to get control of the situation before anyone could get hurt. When I finally reached Derek, I shouted, "What happened? Why didn't you call for help?" His eyes were wild. He responded, barely audible, "I can't let it in." I thought he was just panicking, but the way he spoke chilled me to my core. "What do you mean?" I probed, and that's when he let slip that he'd started to hear voices at night, haunting whispers that beckoned him deeper into the factory's labyrinthine recesses. But he wouldn't explain what they wanted. After that night, I should have put my foot down and had him sent home. Instead, I made the mistake of thinking it could be a phase, until it wasn't. The situation continued to decline. Derek began showing up for work wearing odd clothes, layers of thick clothing that didn't match the factory's barren aesthetic, always dark colors that made him look like he was part of the gloom itself. His productivity dropped, and he started lurking in places where nobody should be, behind stacks of crates, next to machinery that had been out of service for years, places where I couldn't see him, where shadows stretched long and distorted. I confronted him one night, demanding he stop hiding and do his job. That's when I received the worst shock of all. He leaned in close, his breath warm yet filled with an odd chill. "You're wrong to be afraid of the dark," he whispered, and in that moment, I felt a flicker of something, an ancient fear that crawled up my spine like icy fingers. I didn't just feel like he was strange, I felt like I was being hunted by something I couldn't perceive. Things moved downhill from there. In the following days, the factory started to come apart at the seams. Tools were missing. Employees refused to work near Derek, and on one particularly disturbing shift, I found one of my best workers, Jenna, huddled on the floor, shaking, mumbling about someone watching her. I called her name, and as she looked up at me, I saw the fear that had overtaken her, her eyes darting around wildly as though something lurked just behind me. It hit me then that whatever was happening wasn't just in Derek's head, it was in all of ours. It escalated quickly from whispered fears to sheer chaos. One night, Derek disappeared entirely. A heavy noise struck the factory, reverberating through the walls, and next thing I knew, he was gone. Panic rippled through the crew as they searched, calling his name into the void that only muffled laughter seemed to answer. Eventually, we found him, burnt and crumpled, in the old machinery storage room, moaning about having seen the bad thing. Behind him, shadows twisted and stretched in ways they shouldn't. I immediately called for help, but deep down, I knew that help wouldn't arrive in time. That darkness, whatever it was becoming more formidable. That night, I made a choice to confront whatever was lurking. Armed with a flashlight and a handful of courage, I ventured back to the area Derek had been found. The air felt electric, and my heart hammered in my chest. I turned the corner, and the light flickered wildly around the room, revealing scraps of machinery and an endless wall of darkness. It seemed to pulse like it was alive, and as I stood there, a voice, smooth and dripping with malice, whispered my name. I froze, paralyzed with fear. "Join us," it said, its tone effervescent, almost seductive. I stumbled back, and the flashlight flickered before going out completely. I flailed, trying to reignite my courage, when I suddenly heard whispers around me, a cacophony of hushed voices echoing through the void, chanting my name. I fled, knocking over a stack of metal scraps as I scrambled to get away, my heart racing, desperately searching for the exit. As I burst out into the main area, I realized the factory was no longer the same. It seemed more alive, almost sentient. Was it the aftermath of Derek's lingering presence or something immeasurably darker? I couldn't tell. The next morning, I reported everything that happened, but nobody believed me. They thought I was suffering burnout, just another casualty of a troubling night shift. But I dealt with a difficult situation at work, and I had to implement my strategy of survival. I quit the job. Every night since then, I dream about that factory, and I think of Derek, and sometimes I hear my name whispered among the shadows. When I lay in bed, I can almost convince myself that I'm safe, but deep down, I know they're still out there, waiting, watching, and who knows how many others will find themselves trapped in their own nightmares. So, if you ever find yourself in a factory that feels a tad too dark, remember my story and don't look too closely into the shadows. You just might discover something looking right back at you. The first time I heard about the group was during a casual conversation at a local cafe. I was nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, feeling more than a little lost in life, when an acquaintance mentioned a secret society that met every Tuesday night. My interest piqued as he described how members shared their passions and unlocked hidden potentials. He spoke in hushed tones, like the mere mentioning of it could invoke some great curse. I thought it was intriguing, yet part of me dismissed it as another one of those quirky clubs that promised enlightenment but delivered nothing more than a flat tire and a bruised ego. After a long week of monotonous days spent at my desk job, however, curiosity wormed its way into my mind, and before I knew it, I found myself searching online for any traces of this so-called group. I stumbled upon a hidden forum, the kind that requires a little digging and the correct passwords whispered in dark corners. I filled out the application form out of pure impulse, thinking I'd never hear back, and even if I did, I could always back out at the last moment. But then, just 2 days later, I received an email inviting me to their next gathering. This was it. I was going to meet my tribe. After work that Tuesday, I took a deep breath and let the excitement build within me as I made my way to the specified location, a rundown old building on the edge of town, its windows covered in dust, the kind of place that almost felt alive with secrets. When I arrived, I was greeted by dim lighting and a sense of anticipation that filled the space as if charged with electricity. People milled about, whispering to one another, some in small clusters while others stood alone, yet every pair of eyes seemed to hold an unspoken understanding. I felt a nervous thrill ripple through me as I stepped inside. It only took a moment before a woman with ice blue eyes approached me. Her name was Clara, and with an easy smile, she welcomed me as if she had known me for years. Clara introduced me to the others, a diverse group whose ages ranged from teenagers to retirees, each one graced with an air of authenticity I had sought my whole life. There was David, a thoughtful young man who shared tales of his travels across the globe, Maria, an artist who created mesmerizing, life-size sculptures of animals crafted from everyday objects, and Leonard, a retired professor with an infectious sense of humor that made everyone laugh, even if his jokes often went over my head. As the night wore on, we engaged in an array of activities, storytelling, shared vulnerabilities, and laughter that echoed into the dark recesses of the building. It felt like I had finally found a place where I belonged, like my pieces fit into the puzzle without struggle. But then, just as I was beginning to relax into this new comforting reality, Clara spoke up, her tone shifting to something more serious. She began to share their true purpose as it was explained to me, creating and sharing art that reshapes perceptions, pushing boundaries not just of creativity, but of existence itself. We're all searching for something, she said, eyes gleaming. Beyond friendship, beyond shared interests, we seek to unlock the hidden parts of our souls through a deeper connection to our art. Intrigued but cautious, I found myself drawn deeper into the fabric of this new society. They had a way of pulling me in, encouraging me to explore. Week after week, I attended meetings, pouring my heart into projects that pushed me far beyond my previous artistic limitations. I felt exhilarated as I shared my work with them, and I truly believed the bonds we were forming were magical. But as the days turned into weeks, a peculiar undercurrent ran through the gatherings, something unsettling that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. Whispers circled sometimes about the rite, a ritual performed in secrecy to truly become one with the tribe. I asked Clara about it one night, somewhere between creating clay masks and painting in languid brushstrokes, and she smiled faintly, brushing it off as a tradition that was less about strangeness and more about commitment. It's nothing to worry about, she said, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was entering waters far deeper than I realized. My anxiety heightened as the next gathering approached. I couldn't pinpoint what frightened me, the idea that I was possibly losing myself in this world or the realization that maybe this tribe wasn't all it seemed. Yet, the buzz of excitement overrode my doubts, so that when the night finally arrived, I found myself standing before the group, gathered in a circle illuminated by flickering candles. Clara delivered a speech about unlocking the true potential of creativity, and the air thickened, electricity coursing through the room like a living entity. I could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing against my ribs. They invited us one by one to step into the center, but when it was my turn, I hesitated. It's time to connect, Clara urged with an intensity in her eyes that held me captive. The room started to pulse with a rhythm unlike anything I'd felt before, and with every second that passed, I wrestled against both fear and curiosity. When I finally stepped into the circle, I felt lightheaded, the energy surrounding me wrapping like a cocoon. The others began chanting softly, creating a hum that resonated deep within my chest. I closed my eyes. That's when I felt it, a sudden dive into something profound, raw, and strangely vivid. My mind began to swirl with images, layers peeling back to reveal fragments of myself I had long buried. I could see the hurt, the joys, the fears, and the strange things I had carried like burdens. But then, as quickly as it arrived, the visions turned dark. Unfathomable dread gnawed at the edges of the ecstatic feeling until I suddenly felt trapped. I opened my eyes to find everyone staring at me, but their expressions weren't welcoming. They seemed to be scrutinizing me, like I was a puzzle piece they were trying to fit into their tapestry of existence. Anguish coursed through me as I realized in that moment that I was not unleashing my creativity but feeding something sinister lurking beneath the surface. An urgent voice clamored in my mind, "Run." But my legs felt like they were stuck in wet cement. Panic flooded my nervous system. Muffled voices echoed around me, and I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing for it to be over. Finally, I broke free, stumbling backward, nearly tripping over the candles that flickered ominously, their flames dancing dangerously close to my panic. I bolted for the exit, the cacophony of chants following me as I burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. The realization hit me like a thunderbolt. I had invaded their sanctum, dipped a toe into a world I wasn't meant to understand. As I ran away from that place, the gravity of what I'd experienced weighed heavily upon me. I joined a new group. I thought I'd found my tribe, but it turned out I had stumbled into something dark and sinister, people whose creativity needed to be fed by experiences I was not ready to confront. I locked myself in my apartment that night, pouring every ounce of energy into creating and sharing art through healthier means. The emails and messages from the group continued to pour in, increasingly desperate in their attempts to draw me back in, but I knew that finding a true tribe never meant losing myself in the shadows. I finally discovered that it's okay to avoid some doors, and maybe finding your tribe sometimes means knowing when to turn back when those doors threaten to consume you whole. I never expected to find strength in my darkest moment, but that's exactly what happened last winter. It all started when my parents decided to sell our family home. I was crushed. That place held all my memories, wrapped in the scent of fresh-baked cookies and the laughter of family gatherings. My parents saw it as a step forward. It would give us a fresh start, they said, but to me, it felt like the end of the world. And then came the news that turned my world upside down. My dad had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I still remember the way my mom looked when she told me, her face hollow, eyes red and swollen from crying. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and my heart felt heavy, sinking into a place I wouldn't dare to acknowledge. We had to move out of the house before the treatment began, as medical expenses were eating our savings. So there I was, an 18-year-old girl having to pack up my childhood, knowing it would be one of the last times I saw my dad looking so vibrant in that living room, the place where he'd told me stories of heroes who overcame impossible odds. I can't say I didn't go into a stupor. I hyper-focused on the mundane, shoving clothes and knickknacks into boxes, avoiding the emotional weight of the moment. Each box felt like a tomb for the memories they contained, a grave I didn't want to dig. The universe had a cruel sense of humor. We moved into a cramped apartment where every noise echoed, amplifying the separation from my old life. As my dad started his chemotherapy, I felt myself retreating deeper into isolation. The weight of my sadness was relentless. I stopped hanging out with friends and began binge-watching shows, trying to drown out reality. It was during one of these solitary nights that I stumbled upon something odd, an old diary of mine buried beneath cardboard. I hadn't touched it in years, but something compelled me to open it. As I flipped through the pages, I found a collection of stories I had written as a kid. They were tales of adventure, courage, and facing fears. I was amazed by the spirit I had then, and it sparked a fire deep inside me, a reminder of resilience. I knew I had a choice. I could wallow in despair, or I could channel this energy into something meaningful. That night, I decided to confront my fears head-on. Inspired by my younger self, I wrote a new story, this time using my dad as the main character, battling a shadowy monster that represented his illness. Each night, I added to it, pouring my heart into every word. It was therapeutic. I laughed and cried as I crafted this new narrative. My dad was my hero, and I knew he needed encouragement now more than ever. As the weeks turned into months, I began reading my story to him during chemo sessions. He listened intently, eyes sparkling with pride and laughter escaping his lips. Each chapter seemed to energize him, and I would watch the weariness fade from his face, if only for a moment. I could see that writing was not just saving me, it was healing him too. It became our ritual, a beacon of hope amidst the storm. We began to seek out joy in the littlest moments, like celebrating a good day of treatment with homemade pancakes or reminiscing about silly memories from my childhood. I could see my dad growing stronger, and it pushed me to focus on my own strength. But life is not always blissful, and just when I thought we had found our rhythm, we got devastating news. The doctors had recommended experimental treatment, which had an 80% chance of success, but it was risky and expensive. We could either pursue it or continue with the existing course, but only for a limited time. I could feel the walls closing in again. The fear of losing him was almost unbearable. In that moment, I realized I had to take charge, and that's when the real test of strength began. I started researching crowdfunding options, learned about grants, and sought out local businesses that supported medical cases. I mobilized friends and family, pouring every ounce of my energy into organizing a fundraising event. It felt surreal, but the community responded with a passion I never expected. A small food festival was born, and it attracted hundreds of people, all there to support my family. Through laughter and tears, we raised enough to cover the experimental treatment and beyond. When I presented the check to my dad, the tears streaming down his cheeks mirrored my own. That day, I felt a rush of empowerment I had never known before. I was no longer the scared little girl hiding in her room. I was a warrior, fighting for my family. Weeks later, we learned that the treatment was successful. I still remember the day my dad got the all-clear. He embraced me tightly, murmuring words of love. It turned out that we didn't just fight through adversity, we thrived because of it. I had discovered strength, not just in myself, but in the connections forged during the struggle. I still write stories, now with a renewed purpose fueled by love and resilience. Adversity did not break me, it shaped me into someone who knows how to fight for what truly matters. And although life continues to throw challenges my way, I stand ready, fueled by the knowledge that I have survived, that I'm capable of greatness, even when the path seems consumed by darkness. So if there's one thing I can impart to anyone going through tough times, embrace the pain, channel it, and create something beautiful from the ashes of adversity. You might just find your strength in the most unexpected of places. I'll never forget the day I learned to embrace my quirks. It started like any ordinary Wednesday, but that afternoon would reveal the bizarre world that lurked just beneath the surface of my reality. As an introverted high school junior, I often found solace in the odd little habits I'd picked up over the years, like counting the number of steps it took to get from my locker to my classroom or reciting the names of all the US presidents backward whenever I felt nervous. My friends thought it was weird. They'd chuckle and suggest I lay off the caffeine. I just shrugged it off and kept doing my thing. That day after school, I took my usual route home through the woods that brushed against the edge of our small town. Those woods had always felt like an escape, a fortress of silence where I could lose myself in thoughts without judgment. But something was different that day. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I noticed a faint rustling off the path, but the curiosity I typically had turned to caution. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about turning back home and burying myself under my comforter. Instead, I pressed on, the allure of the unknown outweighing my anxiety. As I walked deeper into the woods, I heard whispers. They were faint at first, like the crackling of dry leaves, but soon they grew clearer, turning into distinct voices. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart raced as I tried to make out the words. They were chanting something. My instincts screamed at me to run, but something inexplicable kept my feet glued to the ground. I stepped closer, peering through a thicket of branches. And there they were, a group of kids from my school, seated in a circle, their eyes closed, hands clasped together as they swayed. I recognized a few of them, Jamie, with his messy hair, and Sarah, always wearing bright colors. The last member of the group was the mysterious new kid, Max. He was the subject of a lot of whispers, an enigma with a strange aura that seemed to pull people in. I'd heard rumors about him being into weird rituals, and here they were, in the middle of the woods, looking like they were casting some sort of spell. My heart raced, fear mixing with intrigue. That was when I felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of my mind, like a spark igniting something deep within me. In a strange twist, I felt compelled to let go of my reservations. I had never been a part of anything like this, always the awkward outsider, but an overwhelming urge to join them surged through me. I silently stepped through the brush and into their circle, drawn in as if by a magnetic force. They didn't seem to notice me at first, but as I settled down in the grass, I felt a strange warmth envelop me. I sat cross-legged among them, trying to blend in while my pulse raced. Max opened his eyes and glanced in my direction, a smirk creeping onto his face as if he had been expecting me. "Welcome to the awareness circle," he said, his voice smooth like melting honey. That's when I realized I had done something that seemed completely illogical. I had joined a commune of misfits, embracing a bizarre yet thrilling opportunity. Whatever this was, it felt electric. The others didn't mind my presence, but their focus was now on me. They invited me to share my quirks, something I would typically deny doing. When it was my turn, I hesitated, my throat tightening. I felt the weight of judgment before the words even left my mouth. But then the feeling that had brought me there surged through me again, reminding me that I could share without fear. I count everything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Steps, syllables, even breaths sometimes. A soft giggle escaped Jamie's lips, but Max shot him a look that silenced him. "That's great," he said, impatience giving way to curiosity. "No one's perfect. We all have our quirks. That's what makes us unique. Now, how do you feel when you do it?" I felt the rush of warm confidence crash over me. "Safe," I admitted. "Like I'm in control." The group nodded, and then they began sharing their own eccentricities, Jamie's fixation on collecting rocks shaped like animals, Sarah's obsession with memorizing every single Pokémon, and even Max's fondness for talking to inanimate objects as if they were alive. As each unique quirk was shared, a wave of acceptance washed over the group. In that sacred space surrounded by the trees, I felt a tether of camaraderie strengthen between us. We were bonded in our peculiarities, all of the things we were taught to hide suddenly becoming treasures to be celebrated. I could feel the air humming with energy, excitement dancing in the atmosphere. But the whispers returned, bolstered now by our openness. They seemed to wrap around us, urging us deeper into the experience. I closed my eyes and swayed gently with the others, allowing the rhythm to pull me in. Something began to happen. I felt an uncanny connection to the woods, an awakening of sorts. The world around us shifted, glimmers of light beginning to swirl through the foliage. The whispers grew louder, intertwining with our laughter and stories, transcending into something sacred. And then I caught sight of a figure in the distance, a silhouette appearing between the trees, ethereal and beautiful, trailing wisps of light. It resembled a person, but it was clear that it wasn't. The figure beckoned us closer. My heart raced, questions flooded my mind, but I felt compelled to follow, just as the others did. As we approached, the air shimmered with an indescribable light, and with it came a sense of acceptance, a feeling of being seen for who we really were. Standing there, I realized that all our quirks, the counting, the collections, the odd conversations, were threads woven into a beautiful tapestry of individuality. The figure hovered before us, a shape shifting and turning, granting us a glimpse of the truest versions of ourselves. I felt empowered, joyous, each quirk a piece of a puzzle we were finally assembling. The woods pulsated with life, and as we took a collective breath in unison, the figure smiled, and for a moment, I thought I could feel it inside me, an acceptance that dared to exist unapologetically in the world. The moment shattered like glass, and with it, we were thrown from the vision. The figure dissolved into the mist, leaving the woods condensed around us, still and quiet as if nothing had ever happened. It was just us, an ordinary group of misfit high school kids in the woods, yet we carried something that ordinary eyes would never see. As we parted ways that evening, our hearts full, I knew I would never again cower in silence. My quirks were no longer something to hide. They were embraced, celebrated, and empowered. And somehow I got the sense that the magic of that day, of reckoning with who we truly were, lived on, echoing in the whispers of the woods, waiting for anyone brave enough to join. From that day forward, the woods became my second home, a sanctuary to ignite my uniqueness as I made my way through life, quirks and all, finally confident in the realization that it wasn't just okay to be different, it was extraordinary. When I stood up for a cause I believe in, I never imagined it would put me in the crosshairs of something terrifying. It all started on an unremarkable Tuesday, the kind of day where the sun hangs lazily in the sky and the routines of mundane life press ever forward. I was scrolling through various social media feeds when an old friend of mine was live streaming from an animal shelter that had fallen into disrepair. The animals were malnourished, and the building was literally falling apart. Heartbroken, I noticed a group of rallying supporters forming online, determined to raise awareness for the animals who had been rescued and needed homes. Their posts filled my feed, and the passionate cries for help ignited a fire in my gut. Without much thought, I decided to become actively involved, believing fiercely in their cause. I started sharing posts, encouraging people to adopt instead of shop, and organized a small fundraiser, merchandise themed around saving animals, where the profits went directly to the shelter. Bit by bit, the movement gained traction, and people began to show up at the shelter to volunteer, fostering, and adopt. It felt like we were making a difference, that our collective voice was echoing through the community. But just as I felt the warmth of success, a shadow suddenly crept over my enthusiasm. Rumors began swirling about a new owner of the shelter. The former manager, who had mysteriously vanished months prior, was seen lurking around at night, ignoring our signs for help and swatting away our volunteers like flies. I brushed it off initially, thinking they were just stupid urban legends fabricated by bored kids, but the signs began to get weirder. One night, I stayed late to help with a fundraising event, and as I was cleaning up, I saw him, a tall, gaunt figure out of the corner of my eye, creeping along the perimeter of the shelter. My heart raced as he approached, his eyes glimmering with something unidentifiable, something dead. I tried to confront him, but he vanished into the shadowy corners of the building before I could muster a coherent sentence. It unnerved me, but I refused to be discouraged. After all, I was fighting for a cause bigger than myself. Days turned into weeks, and more strange events followed. I started receiving bizarre hate messages on social media, anonymous threats from opposing accounts, accusing me of complicity in animal trafficking and warning me to back off from the shelter. Each message dug deeper than the last, but I was fueled by my commitment, so I counted this as a win for awareness. That's when it reached a boiling point. One night, the shelter was vandalized. Windows were shattered, and heartbreaking images of our beloved animals were spray-painted over the walls. I was furious but also terrified. It was clear now, someone wanted to sabotage our cause. I called an emergency meeting with the other volunteers, and we brainstormed ways to make our movement even bolder. We planned a protest scheduled for a Friday, intending to overshoot our goals. We made signs, chanting, "Save the animals," with voices melding into a roaring sea of hope and determination, but nothing prepared me for the chaos that would soon ensue. I returned from the meeting, planning to rest up. That night, however, I awoke to the sound of scratching outside my window. I thought it was just a stray cat, but when I looked out, my eyes locked onto him, the gaunt figure. Standing right outside my house, his gaze fixated on me, unmoving. Shivers trickled down my spine, and I stumbled back, closing the blinds. The next morning, my heart felt heavier, but I was not going to let fear win. I resolved to bring the fight to the streets, ignited by the thought of helpless animals needing protection. The day of the protest arrived, dozens showed up, united behind our cause. We marched in formation, chanting with conviction, but as we turned onto the corner, something strange happened. The air felt electric, like the atmosphere was charged with dread. Suddenly, from nowhere, a group of individuals in dark hoodies emerged, forming a barrier in front of us. Their leader, a burly man with a wild beard and eyes screaming madness, shouted, "This place is ours. You think you can just come in and take what we built? You'll pay for this." I felt a cold sweat enveloping me. The crowd was anxious now, the unnerving standoff grew thicker with tension, and I found the strength to step forward, yelling, "You don't own these animals. They deserve a chance." My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins as the crowd surged behind me, chanting our mantra louder, more defiantly. But I never expected him to react the way he did. The man pulled a crowbar from his belt and charged at me, shouting obscenities. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching a horror movie unfold but was stuck inside the frame. I ducked just in time, the heavy metal whistling past my ear, only narrowly missing me as I crumpled forward. The crowd erupted in chaos, screams pierced the air as people began to scatter. Amid the panic, I spotted the tall, gaunt figure right behind me, now gifting a chilling smile that sent terror bubbling deep in my gut. "You shouldn't have stood up," he hissed, eyes blazing with malice. Before I could scream, he lunged at me, grabbing a fistful of my shirt just as I felt others beside me fighting him and the crowd vice-grip past us. In the mayhem, I felt my legs give out as I was dragged backward. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, the police began to arrive, sirens blaring, chaotic lights illuminating our park that once embodied freedom. They separated us, and the leaders of the opposing side were cuffed and pulled away, their faces twisted in fury. I was left trembling, full of shock but somehow relieved. Moments later, when I finally caught my breath, it hit me, despite the fears and physical danger, we made an impact. Hours turned into days, and that terrifying encounter transformed into calls for justice. Community support skyrocketed. More media attention came our way, and rather miraculously, the shelter underwent a complete transformation, renovated, revitalized, everything shifting toward positivity. Today, when I stand in front of the shelter, I see a home, an oasis for abandoned animals. And every time I walk through those doors, I remember the price we paid for this sanctuary is a testament of strength. Each time I hear the soft paws patter against the floor, I understand that standing up for what we believe in may cost us everything, but the outcome of courage and love. That is a price worth paying. So when someone asks me if I'd ever do it again, I smile softly and reflect, you better believe it. I never considered myself a nosy neighbor, but you know how it is when you live in a small town. Everyone notices everything, and news travels faster than the wind. It was a chilly Sunday evening when I first noticed something was off at 14 Maple Street, the Johnsons' house. The curtains were drawn tighter than usual, and I hadn't seen them out in days. Normally, they were a lively couple, out mowing their lawn or tending to their garden, but now, silence. So, naturally, I thought it would be a good deed to swing by with some homemade cookies as an excuse to check in on them, see if they needed anything. As I approached their front porch, a feeling of unease washed over me. The air was thick and still, the twinkling lights of the street lamps barely cutting through the darkened windows of their home. I knocked hesitantly on the weathered wooden door, and after a few moments, I heard some shuffling inside. I waited, the tension building in my stomach when I was greeted only by silence once again. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. Finally, a shuffle came closer, and through the small glass window in the door, I saw a faint shadow moving. Almost instinctively, I took a step back, still feeling compelled to stand my ground. The door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Johnson, her face drawn and weary, eyes wide and almost frantic. "Oh, hello. I didn't expect anyone," she stammered, as if she hadn't seen the light of day in weeks. I extended the plate of cookies toward her, smiling. "I just thought I'd check in on you guys. I haven't seen you in a while." Her fingers curled around the plate, and for a moment, I thought I could see a glimmer of something: relief? Gratitude? But then she caught herself, quickly shifting to a more guarded expression. "We've just been busy. Thank you for the cookies. Just maybe another time." It was weird. There was something in her tone, some underlying panic. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Johnson?" I asked, letting concern slip into my voice. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be here. You need to leave." At that moment, a chill ran down my spine, not from the cold evening air, but from the urgency and fear that radiated from her. I didn't move, though. My instinct told me to press, to find out what was happening. "What do you mean? Is Mr. Johnson okay?" I pushed gently. Her eyes darted again, desperate, like a moth fluttering too close to a flame. "He's not himself. Please. Just go." I opened my mouth to respond, but the door swung shut with a finality that left an echo in the emptiness around me. Confusion and worry clashed within me, but curiosity propelled my feet forward as I turned to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong, not just with Mr. Johnson but with the whole situation. A night's sleep did little to dislodge the thoughts spinning in my head, so, against my better judgment, I decided to go back. The next day, I nearly jumped back as I approached the home again, spotting a figure in the backyard through an overgrown patch of hedges. It was Mr. Johnson, or at least what resembled him. He was hunched over, digging furiously in the ground, dirt flying everywhere like he was trying to uncover something buried. What struck me as particularly strange was how much he looked like he hadn't slept in days, hair disheveled, eyes sunken. I felt compelled to call out to him. "Mr. Johnson. Are you okay?" He immediately froze, turning in a jerky, unnatural movement. His gaze met mine, but it was vacant, almost hollow, like he wasn't quite present. "What do you want?" he rasped, and I nearly recoiled. "I was just worried about you. Your wife said you weren't feeling well." Something flickered in his eyes, something almost sinister. "She's lying," he hissed, and then he turned back to digging, as if I were a mere distraction. My heart raced, 1,000 warning bells going off in my mind. The once kind neighborly relationship I cherished was morphing into something frightening, something I couldn't quite place. I stood still for a moment, considering my next move. That's when my gaze drifted beyond him to what he was digging up. Before I could wrap my mind around it, he turned back to me, and the look in his eyes twisted something deep within me. "You should leave. You don't belong here." Just then, a loud crash echoed out from one of the trash cans nearby. An animal. I looked past Mr. Johnson and saw only darkness. Something scuttled away, fast, and in that instance of distraction, Mr. Johnson lunged at me. I barely dodged, adrenaline surging as I stumbled back, my mind racing, the full scope of the situation flooding in. I sprinted toward my house, stumbling over my feet, heart hammering against my ribcage. I didn't stop running until my front door slammed shut behind me. But the panic didn't dissipate. I felt like a cornered animal, trapped with nowhere to turn. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, as though the Johnsons were watching from behind their darkened windows. I tried to push it all out of my mind, thinking perhaps I was just being paranoid, seeing long familiar faces morph into something strange and unfamiliar. I was about to convince myself it was all in my head when a loud thud came from my basement. My heart skipped a beat. I knew without a doubt I had locked the basement door. What was down there? Curiosity gnawed at me, but caution yanked at my instincts. I decided to call the cops. While I waited, I paced back and forth, every creak of the floorboards echoing in the silence. It took an eternity for them to arrive. When they finally did, I practically threw the basement door open, revealing the dark abyss below. The officer shined his flashlight downward, calling out, "Is there someone down there?" I waited for 10, maybe 15 agonizing seconds, until he turned to me, his face pale. "Nothing down there, ma'am." I could feel myself flushing with humiliation. How ridiculous I must have seemed. "I swear I heard something." I stammered, but before I could finish, a low growl echoed from the shadows, freezing us in place. "You should have left it alone," hissed a voice that was unmistakably Mr. Johnson's. We both turned, but the officer stood rigid, his eyes fixated just past my shoulder. I spun around to see him. He was there, but he seemed strangely altered. His face contorted, the edges softening as his eyes began to glisten in the flashlight beam, shifting from a dull fear to sheer malice. "You need to go now," he said, his voice low and empty. The officer raised his weapon, but I could only stand there, frozen, heart racing. I had invited this darkness in when I tried to help. That thought echoed in my mind as I turned and fled back into the house. I grasped my phone, trying to call someone, anyone, but it was useless. The line was dead and the lights flickered ominously overhead. The shadows seemed to seep into the corners, coiling around me, and with a final scream, I heard myself shout, "What did I do to you?" A sibilant whisper rolled through the air, "You've been too curious, dear neighbor. You should have stayed away." I don't remember much after that. I just know I woke to light spilling through my curtains, hoping it was all a terrible dream, but when I reached for my phone, I found the screen shattered, the calls made showing no record. In a panic, I rushed to the window, only to see 14 Maple Street boarded up and dark. Was I going insane? What happened last night? I ran to their house, hoping for answers, only to see a for sale sign planted firmly in the front yard. That night, I spotted Mrs. Johnson, wild-eyed and twitchy, scurrying down the street, looking over her shoulder as if she were being hunted. I called out to her, but she just shook her head and kept moving, disappearing into the shadows. Days turned into weeks, and no sign of the Johnsons came out. As I passed by their house, I could swear someone was watching me from the windows. Every time night fell, the shadows stretched deep, swallowing the street whole. I realized I'd sealed my fate when I thought I could help. I still see that for sale sign when I take my walks, and I never feel alone. No one quite understands why I avoid 14 Maple Street now. Maybe they think I'm just another nosy neighbor, but I know the truth. Some houses hold secrets better left undisturbed, and sometimes, helping others comes at a price you can never pay. I never believed in the whole find your inner peace nonsense. To me, it sounded like a catchy phrase used to sell scented candles and overpriced yoga mats. But after a stressful year, complete with a grueling job, a breakup, and the constant hum of self-doubt, I figured I had nothing to lose. That's how I found myself in a small, nondescript yoga studio just a few blocks from my apartment, the kind of place you might walk past without a second glance. The studio was dimly lit, infused with that overly calming aroma that somehow felt a bit too artificial, the flickering candles casting spooky shadows against the peeling paint. As I signed in, the instructor, a lean woman with long, flowing hair, smiled at me with a warmth that made me both comforted and uneasy. Her eyes had an unsettling depth, as if she could see right through me. "Welcome," she said softly. "You're here to find peace, right?" My gut twisted, but I nodded, hoping no one would notice my nervousness. The classes began with a kind of meditative breathing that I found painfully mundane. I kept glancing at the clock as the seconds ticked by with excruciating slowness. I didn't feel any different, and with every pose I struggled to hold, my inner cynic only grew louder, mocking the whole experience. But then came the final pose, the Shavasana, where we were instructed to lie flat on our backs, letting go of everything, both physically and mentally. I closed my eyes, willing myself to relax, but the thoughts kept pouring in like a raging river: bills, work, loneliness. And then, as if someone flipped a switch in my brain, my surroundings faded into darkness. When I finally opened my eyes, I was no longer in the studio. Instead, I found myself in a lush, dense forest, the smell of pine thick in the air. Confusion washed over me, and I sat up, taking in my surroundings. The trees towered above me, their leaves whispering secrets only they could understand. It felt so real, almost too real, and I could hear a soft trickle of water nearby. Driven by curiosity, I followed the sound and soon stumbled upon a pristine stream, its water crystal clear and alive with movement. Kneeling beside it, I splashed my face, feeling the refreshingly cold water wake me up from a stupor. Just then, I noticed something glimmering beneath the surface, an object glowing faintly like a small orb. Without thinking, I reached down and grabbed it, bringing it up to my face. The moment I touched it, everything around me shifted and started to blur. I gripped the orb tighter, feeling an energy surge through me, and in an instant, I was transported again, this time to a cramped room filled with the scent of incense and dim candlelight. It was the yoga studio, but everyone was gone. I was alone now, the class empty, as that same instructor watched me from a distance, her expression unreadable. "You have found something special," she said in that low, melodic voice that echoed around the room. "The orb is a gateway, a conduit to true clarity. Use it wisely." My heart raced. "What do you mean?" I managed to stammer. "To find your true self, you must first face your fears," she said, her gaze piercing through me. "You've only begun to scratch the surface of your potential." I felt a shiver run through me. I had always buried my fears deep down, masking them with sarcasm and a facade of indifference. "You must reflect, and only then will you find the peace you seek," she continued. I wanted to argue, to push back against her preachiness, but her words filled me with a strange sense of urgency. I was jolted forward into a series of scenes, my memories playing out in rapid succession, all the moments of pain I had tried to bury. I confronted the day my father left us, the heartbreak of my first love, and the times I felt utterly alone in a crowded room. Each memory sank into me like a heavy stone, forcing me to confront the realities I had been avoiding all this time. I screamed, trying to escape the chain of memories, but I was trapped, each painful moment intertwining with the next, feeling more vivid than before. Suddenly, everything around me froze, and I was back in the deserted studio, breathless and trembling. The instructor stood closer now, that same serene smile on her face. "You see, the path to inner peace is not without its trials," she said, almost proudly. "You're not meant to escape these experiences, you are meant to embrace them." I gritted my teeth, wanting to argue that embracing pain was overrated, but something inside told me she was right. I clutched the orb tighter, feeling the energy flow through me again. The memories, while painful, were also mine, pieces of a puzzle that told my story. The instructor gestured for me to let it go. "Only then will you see your path forward." With all my might, I threw the orb into the air. It burst into thousands of shimmering particles, filling the room with light. The particles swirled around me, enveloping me, and for a moment, I felt weightless, as if my spirit had detached from my body. It was intoxicating, freeing, enlightening. And when the light finally faded, I felt different. Returning to the forest, everything was crisp and bright, yet eerily serene. I noticed the colors were more vivid, the air felt more alive. I began walking again, now aware of the whispers from the trees, each one a story, a warning, a piece of wisdom. The ground beneath my feet felt soft and inviting, and for the first time, I truly appreciated my surroundings, the beauty that existed just outside my bubble of self-pity. Suddenly, a deer leapt in front of me, its eyes wide and bright, but instead of fleeing, it looked straight into my own. In that moment, I realized I was part of something much larger, a rhythm, a flow that tied all living things together. Time lost its grip on me as I roamed the forest, searching for clues, facing my fears one last time. I leaned heavily on my breath, not the shallow gasps that anxiety often brought, but deep, expansive breaths filled with intention. Minutes felt like hours, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting shades of orange and purple across the sky, I returned to that shimmering stream. Kneeling once more, I cupped my hands to drink, savoring the cool, refreshing water. As I stood, I caught my reflection in the stream, and for the first time, I saw someone I could respect, a person willing to face their truth. The final moment came swift. I found myself back in the yoga studio, surrounded by my classmates who looked at me, eyes sparkling with an entirely different energy. "Welcome back," the instructor said knowingly. I didn't respond, but I felt lighter, a weight lifted from my shoulders, the warmth of acceptance wrapping around me. The class ended like any other, but for me, it was profoundly different. I didn't leave that studio the same person who walked in. I had faced my fears, embraced my pain, and discovered the truth hidden beneath it all. I felt unusually alive, and as I left, I caught a glimpse of the world around me, vibrant, raw, and beautifully chaotic. I smiled knowingly, embracing my newfound perspective. Inner peace wasn't a place I arrived at, it was simply a decision to face my reality as it came, beautifully imperfect, unbearably honest. That night, as I laid in bed, I closed my eyes and exhaled. Peace enveloped me, whispering promises of brighter tomorrows. I drifted off, knowing the journey was just beginning. Who knew how many other unexpected paths awaited, and how often I'd need to return to that little studio to rediscover it? I never thought I'd find myself in a situation that would change my life forever, but there I was, standing in a dimly lit room, surrounded by strangers, 6 of them to be exact, and we were all crammed into what might as well have been a haunted house. Instead, it was a dilapidated cabin somewhere deep in the woods, far away from civilization. My heart raced, not just from the ghostly ambience but because we were there for a purpose. Each of us had received a strange invite to this group. I wasn't even sure how they found me. Just like everyone else in the room, we all felt this bizarre pull to be there, drawn by the promise of learning how to communicate better in dire circumstances. I should have known it would turn ugly. The 5 others introduced themselves, their faces reflecting a spectrum of mixed emotions, nervousness, excitement, and a hint of dread. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made you feel like you were perpetually on the edge of your seat. I wasn't entirely sure what to expect as our focus turned to the host, a lanky man who introduced himself as Jacob. He looked the part of a charlatan, all disheveled hair and eyes that darted around like he was trying to make sense of his own ideas. Without preamble, he began to explain that we were there to participate in a radical form of communication training. As he spoke, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. There were rumors swirling around our town about Jacob, a man known for orchestrating bizarre social experiments that often ended in chaos. It was almost like he craved unpredictability, creating tense scenarios to stress-test relationships. Before I could process my thoughts, Jacob dropped the bombshell: we'd be simulating a dangerous hostage situation. The rules were simple: we had to communicate effectively to defuse the situation and successfully rescue a presumably captured person, who Jacob would appoint. My heart sank. Was this really what I signed up for? But before I could voice my dissent, he announced the first exercise. He instructed one of the others, a calm-looking woman who introduced herself as Lily, to act as the hostage. The rest of us had to roleplay as the negotiators, and tensions soared the moment the fake gun was introduced. Jacob acted as the threat, pacing like a caged animal with that maniacal glint in his eyes. The chaos unfolded rapidly. I remember clearly trying to communicate in a way that would resonate with the threat, my palms sweating profusely as I fumbled through my words. The reality was terrifying. Despite being a simulated exercise, it felt real. Lily's eyes widened in fear, the pretend scenario taking on a life of its own. Jacob stared us down with unyielding intensity, demanding we find common ground with the hostage-taker. I struggled, feeling the weight of the group's expectations as I attempted to maintain composure. Voices clashed in the fray, everybody clamoring for their chance to talk. The more we spoke, the angrier Jacob became, wielding his gun in exaggerated wild movements while mocking our attempts. The energy shifted sharply to chaos. At one point, I yelled out, desperate to be heard. I remember looking at Jacob, his twisted smile sending chills down my spine, as he pointed his prop weapon at me. As we floundered and fought, I noticed another participant, a quiet guy named Mark, who seemed to be observing rather than participating. I felt a strange kinship with him, but even then, any thoughts of camaraderie were drowned in the overwhelming anxiety of the scenario. The cries grew louder. There was a distinct chance that we could all emerge worse than we entered this labyrinth of manipulation, but as feelings of frustration escalated into palpable fear, something inside me snapped. I stepped forward, commanding attention in a shaky voice. Wait. Everyone, stop. We need to breathe. Time seemed to freeze for just a moment as the shifting faces turned toward me with a mix of confusion and hope. I didn't even know where this newfound courage came from, but the words flowed. This isn't helping anyone. Jacob, you're being too aggressive. We're not going to get anywhere this way. The air shifted, the tension dissipating like steam from a pot. Jacob's smile faltered for just a second, and I seized the opportunity to elaborate. I directed my gaze at Lily, linking eyes with her. I whispered, we're going to get you out of here. We just need to talk." The others echoed this sentiment, and for the first time in hours, everyone appeared willing to collaborate. Jacob stood there, looking bewildered, as if the very essence of the exercise was unraveling before his eyes. I realized that's all I had to do, intervene when things spiraled and bridge the gap with heartfelt communication. It wasn't just about the words, it was the spirit behind them. I gathered myself, looking at each face and sharing the truth of our shared experience. We were all scared. Jacob's demeanor shifted, his game revealed. The situation didn't have to maintain this frantic pace. As our collective anxiety began to change its shape, Jacob, rather than fighting it, something shifted in him too. He dropped the facade, nodding slowly, biting his lip as if working through a revelation of his own. One by one, others began to reflect on their feelings, sharing genuine vulnerabilities. We were no longer just role-playing, we were building a bridge. As the night drew on, the timer, which had been counting down, blinked successively to 0. It was the first time I felt authentic communication flowing in a way I had only hoped it would. It wasn't just a lesson about techniques or strategies, it was a raw glimpse into human connection. To my shock, Jacob, who had been so set on chaos, admitted that his entire experiment had come from a place of fear, his own doubts about interpersonal relationships, something almost unfathomable given his earlier demeanor. It became clear we were all fighting battles that needed our voices to transcend them. Communication is not simply about being articulate, it's about vulnerability, understanding, and knowing when to step back. The hostage scenario ended, but my lessons had just begun. After that night, I found myself reaching out in ways I'd never imagined. I transformed how I navigated conflict, how I connected with loved ones, and how I truly listened. Even when I left that dilapidated cabin, the most haunting realization lingered. Learning to communicate effectively isn't just a skill, it's a profound journey that intertwines with the very core of who we are. The truth is, I walked in expecting a shallow list of tricks. Instead, I stumbled upon raw honesty, and in that little cabin in the woods, I found the courage to face not only others but also my own fears. Ultimately, that night taught me the most crucial lesson of all. In difficult situations, it's not so much about winning a conversation as it is about nurturing the human connection. I still carry that with me today, trying to communicate effectively, even in the midst of a storm. I never expected my life could change in a single day, much less because of my golden retriever, Max. You see, Max is not your ordinary pet, he's a bundle of energy wrapped in fur, with a knack for getting himself into trouble. The day started like any other Saturday, with plans to take Max to the local dog park. Little did I know, that day would turn into a hilarious escapade worthy of a viral internet moment. As I gathered his leash and some dog treats, Max was his usual self, tail wagging, nearly knocking over my cup of coffee in his excitement. We drove to the park with Max's head sticking out the window, ears flopping in the wind. Upon arrival, I let him off the leash. In a flash, he darted towards a group of kids playing frisbee, oblivious to everything around him. I chuckled at his antics as he raced around, barking with pure joy, blissfully ignoring my voice calling him back. Then came the moment that would make this day unforgettable. Amidst the laughter and shouts of children, I suddenly spotted a familiar face amongst the crowd, a famous local Instagram influencer, Melanie. She often posted adorable pictures of her cat, Sugar, with captions that garnered thousands of likes. Of course, I couldn't resist the opportunity to take a selfie with her. After all, this could bring notoriety to my own Instagram account, which had long been stuck at a measly few hundred followers. As I approached, I was distracted when I saw Max prancing around with something in his mouth. At first, I thought it was just a stick or some trash, but as I got closer, my heart sank. It was a bright pink, fuzzy unicorn toy, one of Sugar's prized possessions. Apparently, Max had done what Max does best, steal something delightful from someone else's picnic. Before I could shout for him to drop it, he pranced over to Melanie, waving the unicorn toy like a trophy. She looked horrified, her mouth agape as Max dropped it at her feet and proceeded to bark enthusiastically as if saying, "Look what I found." In that moment, I was torn between apologizing and laughing uncontrollably. As if in slow motion, Melanie bent down, and instead of scolding my dog, she made a big show of picking it up. "Oh my gosh, Max, you found my Sugar's favorite toy," she exclaimed, her distinct influencer tone bubbling with excitement. Everyone around us, dog owners, kids, other Instagrammers, turned to see what the commotion was about. Flustered and in a mix of panic and amusement, I started to approach them, ready to intervene. But before I could reach them, in the midst of a playful tussle for the unicorn toy, Max decided it was time to put on a show, not just for Melanie, but for the entire park. With a surprising leap, he snatched the unicorn back, shook it vigorously, and began tugging at it with all his might. The sight of a goofy golden retriever holding onto a fluffy unicorn while a group of kids attempted to coax him into letting it go was nothing short of hilarious. Max was basking in the attention, tugging harder as if it were a high-stakes game between him and the kids. Laughter erupted around us, including from Melanie, who had momentarily forgotten about her cat's loss. To everyone's delight, Max then executed a stunt unlike any seen before. He took off running while still clutching the unicorn, the kids following closely behind, all of them giggling and shrieking. I watched in disbelief as Max ran across the park with several enthusiastic children in hot pursuit, the fuzzy unicorn trailing behind like a flag. It was as if they were in an impromptu chase scene from a movie, and everyone on the sidelines couldn't help but cheer them on. In mere moments, I had gone from a worried dog owner to the proud parent of the canine star of the day. The hilarity of the situation only intensified when Max decided to jump into the park's small pond, unicorn still in tow. Water splashed everywhere, soaking those nearby, including Melanie. Just when I thought he couldn't get any funnier, Max tried to shake off the water, sending drops flying everywhere while still proudly holding the unicorn in his mouth. Kids were laughing, some were attempting to dodge the spray, and Melanie burst into laughter, her phone already recording the entire ridiculous spectacle. I couldn't believe my eyes. Something that started as a potential embarrassment had turned into an unforgettable comedy show. In the aftermath, once Max was dripping wet but still a vibrant ball of excitement, Melanie came over, still giggling. "You've got quite the character here. He might just be better than my cat for content," she said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. Before I knew it, she had posted a video of Max's antics on her Instagram, tagging me. The caption read, "When your favorite toy becomes a big, furry superstar." The post went viral. I was bombarded with notifications as followers poured in, curious about Max who had stolen the show, quite literally. By the time we returned home, I was still processing everything. Max had turned our ordinary Saturday into an unforgettable tale of hilarity, complete with soaking wet clothes, a viral moment, and a newfound friendship with a local influencer. That night, I posted a few pictures on my own account, showcasing the day's events, from Max's coy looks to him proudly lounging with the unicorn. To my surprise, it garnered likes, comments, and new followers at a rate I never anticipated. Soon, our little family, Max, my wife, and I, became internet stars in our own right, all thanks to one unforgettable day fueled by that silly golden retriever's antics. From that day on, whenever someone asked why I loved my pet so much, I couldn't help but smile and recount the tale of the day Max did something unforgettable. The day started like any other. The sun peeked through my curtains as my alarm buzzed incessantly, pulling me from sleep. The edges of my dreams began to dissolve, replaced by the familiar hum of reality. My parents had always been more of an enigmatic presence in my life, their relationship strained ever since my father lost his job. They were always there, but the walls of our house felt thick and suffocating, silence hanging heavily in rooms that had once buzzed with laughter. I had grown used to the empty exchanges, the distant glances. It was an unspoken agreement to ignore the tension. But that day, something felt different. My father's footsteps echoed with an unusual urgency down the hallway, and I glanced at the clock. It was barely 8 in the morning. I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever this was. He stepped into my room without knocking, the usual boundaries blurred by an unmarked desperation I had yet to identify. "We need to talk," he said, his voice a raspy whisper, as though afraid to disturb the silence, even more afraid of what he might reveal. My heart raced as I swung my legs out of bed. "Is it about Mom?" I asked, not certain if I'd spoken too soon. His expression changed, the tension around his mouth tightening, but he didn't answer, just shuffled his feet against the floor, avoiding eye contact. That's when I thought of running, but I didn't. Before I could muster the courage, he gestured for me to follow him downstairs. I was apprehensive but intrigued. This wasn't the kind of talk we had ever had, and to be honest, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. As we descended the staircase, I noticed the walls lined with frames, each photo frozen in a moment of happiness we no longer seemed capable of. When we reached the living room, he motioned me to sit on the couch. I complied, folding my hands together, hoping that perhaps this was a conversation that would lead us to some clarity. He sat across from me, his brow furrowed in contemplation, and after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "You remember when I used to tell you those stories about my childhood?" I nodded slowly, reminding him of the bedtime tales filled with goofy adventures and life lessons. A flicker of recognition sparked in his eyes, but it quickly extinguished. "Well, there's something I didn't tell you, something I've been carrying for a long time." The air between us thickened, I could feel his vulnerability laying bare. I grew up in a different world, one where everything seemed perfect on the outside, but it was a complete facade. He paused, and I could feel my heartbeat throbbing in my ears. "My father, your grandfather, he wasn't who you think he was. He was charming, yes, but he had a darkness too, and no one in the family wanted to see it." My stomach knotted as he continued. "He was controlling, demanding perfection at every turn. It was like living under a microscope, and when I failed to meet his expectations, the consequences were severe. I think I learned to bottle things up, to wear a mask, to shield the world from my pain." The air grew heavier with each confession, each revelation like a shard cutting deeper. I had never thought of my father as anything but solid, a pillar in our chaotic lives. But here he was, sharing pieces of himself I had never known existed. "I never wanted you to feel that pressure, that darkness," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "But I was scared, and over the years, I let that fear push us apart. I see now how I've replicated that trauma with you, and it breaks my heart." I could hardly process everything, my mind spun with the realization that we were not so different after all. I had grown reluctant to share my own struggles for fear of burdening him even more, yet here he was, pouring his soul out as though I were a confidant, not just his child. "I wish I had been more honest, more open with you," he said, staring down at his hands as if he could unravel the knots of our lives by sheer will alone. "I didn't want you to become a stranger to me, but I pushed you away." The silence that followed was loaded, charged with unspoken words and mutual understanding. After years of silence, I felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and connect, to bridge the chasm that had widened between us. "Dad, it's okay," I finally said, my voice catching. "I think we both needed to hear this." He looked up at me, eyes glistening. "No, it's not okay." "Not yet," he replied fiercely. "But I want to change that. I want to be someone you can talk to and rely on, not just a distant figure in your life." We both sat in that heavy silence for what felt like a lifetime, exchanging glances that carried the weight of our shared truths. "Can we start over?" I asked hesitantly, feeling the gravity of the moment. "I mean, can we be real with each other?" A hint of a smile broke through as he nodded, his shoulders seeming to relax for the first time that morning. "I would love nothing more," he replied, and, as I watched, the lines of worry etched across his face began to soften, revealing more of the man behind the mask. "If you'll have me." I smiled back, feeling warmth spread through my chest, realizing that the unexpected heart-to-heart we had shared that day might not be the end, but a new beginning, a chance for healing, honesty, and connection in a home that had long since felt like a battleground. We didn't fix everything in that single conversation, of course. There would be more struggles ahead, secrets to unravel, feelings to process. But finally, it felt like we were on the same side, ready to confront our pasts together. We both left the room that morning with a deeper understanding of one another, and it was in that moment that I realized how powerful vulnerability could be, how necessity and fear had kept us apart, and that sometimes, the hardest conversations could pave the way for the most meaningful connections. Little did we know, though, that this was merely the beginning of confronting histories, yours and mine, that hadn't been untangled just yet. I believed we were ready. But what we didn't see coming was that some hidden family secrets were darker than shadows at twilight, and they were waiting just around the corner, ready to crash our newfound bond at a moment's notice. The day I made a New Year's resolution and stuck to it began like any other. It was December 31st, the day everyone was buzzing with excitement, planning their celebrations, and writing out ambitious resolutions they'd inevitably abandon by February. I was sitting alone in my dimly lit apartment, staring at the flickering screen of my laptop, filled with the ghostly echoes of abandoned projects and unfulfilled dreams. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I decided to join the swarm of cliches and make a resolution myself. But as I contemplated all the usual promises, losing weight, quitting smoking, reading more, I felt an unusual weight settle in my gut. I'd never made a resolution I truly believed I'd stick to, and the thought of yet another empty promise gnawed at me. That's when I saw it, a forgotten book on my shelf, its spine cracked, pages yellowed. It was a book on habit formation, and after flipping through it mindlessly, I found a curious line that struck me: the best resolution is one that changes not just your habits but your very reality. So I closed the book and with no more clarity, mumbled to myself, I will stick to my resolution this time, no matter what. I set my phone to remind me the next day, choosing to toy with my resolutions as if they were mere remnants of a passing holiday. However, that night, as I drifted into an unsettling sleep under the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through my window, I felt an inexplicable sense of anticipation, fluttering just beneath the surface, like the stillness before a storm. The next morning, I woke to the sound of frantic rustling and a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. As I slowly opened my eyes, I found myself no longer in my apartment but in an entirely different room, unfamiliar but eerily reminiscent of my own. As I sat up in bed, the decor was a jarring remix of my taste, and the clock displayed a time in the late afternoon. Panic rose within me. I scrambled up and made my way to the window, where the street outside seemed to vibrate with unusual color. It looked like a scene pulled from a fantasy novel, glowing in vibrant hues I'd never witnessed. I stumbled through the door and stepped into the sunshine, only to find the world around me throbbing with this energy I'd never felt before. I regarded the people walking by, their smiles bright, laughter cascading through the air like a melodic waterfall. They greeted me as if they knew me, calling out my name, "Happy New Year, Jonathan." At that moment, I realized I wasn't in my initial reality anymore. I had somehow crossed into a parallel timeline where I had kept every resolution I ever made. The world was thriving, and as I began to interact with the people around me, it became clear they were all versions of myself, different choices made, different roads taken, all somehow merging here. As we talked, they shared stories of adventure, achievement, relationships forged and mended. My life was everything I ever wanted, wrapped up in golden ribbons. But, as exhilarating as it was, a tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was off. Despite the idealism, there was a shaded hollowness in their eyes, as if their reflection was warped by fear of losing this perfect reality. With every smiling face I encountered, I felt the weight of their expectation pressing down, and soon I started searching for an exit, convinced that my presence was a disruption in this beautifully crafted utopia. Just as I felt the world around me begin to shift, creeping at the edges, I sought a solitary timekeeper, someone who could help unravel this mess. I had seen a wise old man sitting at a small cafe, his hair and beard flowing like wisps of tempestuous clouds. His eyes sparkled with knowledge, and he offered sage advice but in riddles. I finally mustered the courage to approach him, my heart racing with unease. "You look lost, young man," he stated, without looking up from his cup. "Tell me, what do you desire?" I explained my situation, how I had stumbled into this reality where I had succeeded at everything but felt adrift. With an amused glint in his eye, he beckoned me closer. "You wanted to keep a resolution, did you not? But in doing so, you've overlooked the most vital resolution of all, to embrace the chaos of life, the unpredictability, the failures." His words pierced through the cloud of my anxiety, awakening a hidden understanding that my perfection was a burden. Tiger stripes that I had admired at first were slowly tightening their grip around my spirit. I realized then the truth presented to me: success meant nothing without genuine struggle and reward, growth through imperfection. The moment was fleeting, but as I pondered those truths, the world around me began to fray. Color faded, laughter dulled, and I found myself in free fall, swept into a dark void before waking up gasping in my own bed. I quickly shot up, heart racing, feeling the cool sheets around me, and my phone buzzed with reminders of New Year celebrations happening around me. The weight of it all began to settle, but a sense of clarity washed over me. I could steer this ship of mine into the storm rather than against it. I vowed then, not for forced perfection but for authentic progress, to embrace my failures as a journey rather than a burden. I picked up my pen to write my resolution for the first time: I will embrace my mistakes and find joy in the learning, because growth comes not from success but from the willingness to fail. As the clock struck midnight again, I breathed in the crisp air of hope that tingled in my chest. I felt lighter, the sun shimmering through my windows, illuminating the clutter and chaos waiting for me to take it on, to savor each moment. I realized the beauty and resilience in forging connections and the continuous evolution of my being. It was the first New Year's resolution I was ready to stick to for good, not through the guise of perfection but in the authenticity of being human. No resolutions can promise a seamless journey, but they can, indeed, carve paths through the chaos if only we dare to keep our footing. When I was young, I never valued friendship the way I should have. I grew up in a small town, a place where everyone knew each other's names and secrets, but I preferred being alone. I thought I was too busy with my things, skateboarding, drawing, and playing video games, to bother with what I considered the trivialities of friendship. One night, after a particularly long day, I decided to ride my board down to the old creek at the edge of town. No one hung around there anymore since it was rumored to be haunted, but I was fascinated. The thrill of breaking the norm, of confronting something sinister, was intoxicating. I made my way down the narrow path, illuminated only by the pale light of the moon filtering through the trees. When I reached the creek, the air was thick with silence, interrupted only by the gentle rustle of leaves that seemed all too eager to share whispers of the past. As I stood there, I noticed something odd in the water, a glimmer that tugged at my curiosity. Leaning over the edge, I saw a small, ornate locket, half buried in the mud. I reached down to grab it, and as my fingers brushed the cold metal, a chill ran down my spine. Something felt wrong, as if I had crossed into another realm. Despite the ominous vibe, the allure of the locket was irresistible. I fished it out and opened it without thinking. Inside, it held a picture of what appeared to be two girls, one of whom looked hauntingly familiar. The moment I locked eyes with that face, a jolt of recognition hit me like a punch to the gut. It was Lily, my childhood best friend, who had mysteriously disappeared a decade prior. My heart raced. I had spent years shoving down the guilt and wonder about what had happened to her, but holding that locket filled me with dread. Suddenly, the night air shifted. A low growl echoed from the trees. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or a trick of the dark, something was watching me. I slammed the locket shut, but before I could make sense of what was happening, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a girl, covered in dirt with wild hair and an expression that was a cocktail of anger and sorrow. "You shouldn't have taken that," she snarled, glaring at the locket in my hand. I wanted to run but was rooted to the spot, caught in her haunted gaze. "You have no idea what you've done." She shimmered like a mirage, flickering in and out of focus, and at that moment, she looked almost like Lily. Her frame was the same, but her mouth twisted in a grimace that made my stomach churn. "You left me," she hissed, as if the darkness had woven itself into every word. The air felt electric, charged with a tension that made it hard to breathe. "I needed you, and you disappeared." I muttered a pathetic excuse, fumbling through memories of school, laughter, and the day everything changed. I tried to explain, but the weight of the years piled high in my throat. "I didn't know." I almost screamed, but she just shook her head, that eerily familiar face, contorted with something like grief. "I waited. You promised you'd never leave." Her voice was low and melodic yet heartbreaking. With a sudden movement, she pointed towards the water. Unsure of what she was asking, I reluctantly knelt beside the bank, where the locket lay. When I peered in, I saw more than just my reflection. I saw flashes of moments with Lily, a playground where we laughed, a camping trip under stars that now shone mockingly bright, and shadows of our shared dreams slipping through our fingers. Tears streamed down my face as the memories enveloped me, each drop heavy with the understanding of how much I had lost. "Please, let me help you," I whispered, desperation creeping into my tone. "I can make it right." That's when she let out a chilling laugh, the sound reverberating through the hollow woods, echoing my failures back at me. "You can't help me. It's too late. But I can help you." In that moment, everything shifted. "What do you mean?" I choked out, desperate for any sign of redemption. "You'll have to learn the hard way what friendship means," she replied, her eyes narrowing. Suddenly, the night swirled around us, enveloping me in a vortex of shadows. I felt myself slip away, suffocated in an inky void until everything went black. When I opened my eyes next, I was standing in my old town, but everything was different. The streets were lined with people, all familiar faces, faces of my childhood friends who I had pushed away for years. As I tried to approach them, to hug them, to make amends, it felt as if I was moving through water, thick and impenetrable. They smiled and waved, but there was a barrier that I could not breach, a pain I realized I had inflicted upon myself by not cherishing those bonds. I watched helplessly as they turned their backs on me, laughing and talking among themselves as if I were the ghost haunting their memories. The regret struck me like a knife. Then I heard her voice again, whispering in my ear, "Understand the value of what you lost." With that, scenes of my life replayed in vivid detail, every chance I had to reach out, every birthday I missed because I was too wrapped up in my solitude, every tear shed by a friend because I chose not to be there. It was a piercing agony that cut deeper than anything physical could. I fell to my knees, begging for forgiveness, knowing that I had taken friendship for granted and only realized its weight when I was faced with the ghost of my past. Just as I thought it couldn't get worse, the vibrant color of life around me drained away. I was submerged back into darkness, which felt deeper this time. The shadow of the girl emerged before me, and I saw her sadness turn into understanding. "You've learned, but learning isn't enough. You have to act on it." And just like that, the night tore apart, and I awoke back at the creek, shaking with fear and realization. The locket was still in my hands, but now it didn't feel like a cursed object. It was a reminder, a promise I needed to keep. Guilt knotted my stomach, but I wiped the tears from my face and ran back up the path, fueled by a newfound determination. I needed to show my friends I cared. They deserved better than the ghost I had been. When I arrived home, I picked up my phone, hands trembling. I called every friend I had lost touch with, one by one, some even laughed when they answered, surprised to hear from me. "Hey, it's been a while," I said, my voice cracking. It wasn't easy to come back, to confront the disappointment I had caused, but each conversation became a stitch in the frayed fabric of relationships I had severed. I made plans, sent apologies wrapped in sincerity, and vowed never to take their presence for granted again. A month later, as I sat on my porch waiting for my friends to arrive for a gathering, I held the locket tightly in my palm, a reassuring weight, and smiled, knowing that each new memory we created anchored me closer to a truth I had almost lost forever. I learned that friendship isn't just a fleeting moment or a connection easily replaced. It's laughter over shared meals, late-night talks about dreams, and even the uncomfortable silences that reaffirm our existence in each other's lives. In the end, I successfully dug myself out of that void where loneliness once lived, discovering that real friendships were not just a choice but a necessity, a lesson learned the hard way, but a lesson I would never forget.